Okay, I'm live or alive or something. I see that a bunch of you have been chatting already for ages. Uh, if you aren't already subscribed, feel free to subscribe. Obviously, if you like this, find it interesting, feel free to give a thumbs up. I'm just looking back through your live chat that you've had while I've not been here. Yeah, always happy to be blamed. I used to always say that in most of my work, like family work and stuff. I'd always say, feel free to just blame me. Just reading. Yeah, you'll start freaking people out um, when you start pointing out that you're predicting their behavior. It's a bit like when you start kind of interpreting people's dreams, people start getting freaked out. Yeah, there's some information. Obviously, I say, yeah, there's some information. No one actually knows what I'm reading. Um, there's some information like about having your little dip in your ultradian rhythm that you would just think that obviously the therapist should know, and you would think that sometimes it's helpful just to tell the client, um, because it can be a very helpful thing to inform people. For example, well, there's a few things that could be helpful. So, uh, for people to know that a panic attack lasts a finite length of time unless you continue feeding it. So, unless you continue doing stuff that keeps you panicking, like having certain thoughts or whatever. Once you learn a bit of information like that, it doesn't mean you can instantly just kind of think, oh, I'll just turn the panic attack off then. But it does mean that you now know, right, so I know that it lasts that finite length of time. If I can start to learn how to perhaps focus my thinking on something else, etc., then the panic attack comes to an end and I'm not restarting it, so to speak. The same with things like cravings. A craving that a smoker may have will last a finite length of time. It's not like one single craving lasts an hour. Um, so when someone learns that it lasts a finite length of time, all of a sudden it's like, so if you can do something just at the so I used to say smokers quite often things like about figuring out what that, what is it that you smoke for, what's smoking your therapy, and then when you get the craving, use that craving as a signal to you to honor whatever that smoking was the therapy for. So say um, the craving is it's time to take a break. You've been doing something for 90 minutes to perhaps approaching 2 hours. It's time to take a break. Well, the craving is telling you it's time to take a break. So do it. Go and take a break. Go and stretch your legs. Go and grab an orange squash, or go and grab a water, whatever it is, some alternative, but take a break, because that's what the message is. Whereas if you don't take a break, you're kind of going against what it was trying to tell you to do. Um, and so all you're doing is then you take that break for the duration that's longer than the craving would have normally have lasted, and for the duration of that kind of ultradian dip. yeah, the 20-minute break is a very good, easy to read book. Definitely recommended. I doubt it's on Kindle because it's a reasonably old book in terms of modern era. I hate saying things are old books when I know that they're not, in my opinion, really old. But what I mean is, it's not Kindle era book. Yeah, you are giving me plenty of reading to catch up on. And I don't think I've got a PDF copy of it. But as I've said before, Ernest Rossi on his website, ernestrossi.com, has dozens and dozens of free PDFs of articles that he's written. There's an ebook, free ebook on there that's quite comprehensive but very easy to read. So all the information that's in things like 20-minute break is on Ernest Rossi's website for free. Back in like 2009, 10, whatever it was that I contacted Ernest Rossi about interviewing him, he very quickly just sort of, he contacted me back and just literally said, here's dozens and dozens and dozens of my papers that I've written, read them, and then I'll do an interview with you. As it had turned out, it was very kind of him to send me those dozens of papers. I'd got all the books that they were all in, and I'd read others that weren't in the books. So there's a few that I hadn't read, but most of them I'd actually already read. How many cups of tea before you're British? I think it's more about how you drink the tea. If tea becomes your problem solver, then you're probably British. If the world's going to pot and the first thing you do is say, look, let's just have a cup of tea, then you know you've got the right attitude. I've received a book in the post the other day that I haven't had time to start reading yet. Probably the only fiction book that I'm likely to read this year. Hopefully, I'm near the bottom of the live chat typing. Yeah, I haven't read many of well, I haven't actually read any of Stephen King's books, but I've watched lots of the films and TV series. Yes, I apologise if my live streams are one of the things taking up all of the reading time. I seem to be live for a long time. Oh, okay, now let's just have it jump all the way down to the bottom. Still reading, but I'm now on since being live, which is good. Yeah, I rarely watch TV. Am I joining you? I'm attempting to get through the all the comments so that I can actually kind of start talking facing the camera a bit more. I do, yes. Currently reading Look Into My Eyes. Cool. Yeah, I don't know if you were in the chats where I mentioned about when I was doing my therapy training, and obviously as part of the therapy training, you meet the client at the university. You know when your client session is during the day. That's going to be observed by 3 students and one of the instructors. You don't know, and if you fail any of the client sessions, you fail the entire course. Um, you don't get told up front what the client's presenting problem is. So the clients are all people who have, um, the company would put out ads in the papers and things back in those days saying we're looking for people who want free therapy. And then those people had to pay or hand over a check for like £50 or whatever. And if they turned up on the day for their free therapy session, then they got the free therapy and the check got ripped up. If they didn't turn up, then the check got cashed. Because obviously the idea was that all the students need clients, real clients to practice on. The last thing you want is someone thinking, well, it was free therapy anyway, it was with students, so I'm not going to bother turning up. So the incentive was your check will get cashed if you don't turn up. And you still had some people who wouldn't turn up, but it reduced how many people wouldn't attend. Um, so you didn't know what uh, the client's problem is that they're presenting with. Um, you have to do therapy with real clients from very near the beginning of the course. So you learn all the basics of doing hypnosis. You learn all the basics. So this was a hypnotherapy course. You learn all the basics of structuring therapy sessions, of understanding the sort of overarching stuff like um, basic emotional needs, people's essential kind of inbuilt innate skills that they have, learning about counseling techniques, various therapeutic techniques, various things like stuff around motivational interviewing, stuff around solution focused therapy, interpersonal therapy, etc. So you learn all the kind of overarching stuff. What you haven't done at this point necessarily, you definitely haven't done it when you get your first client, is you haven't learned about very specific conditions. So you haven't yet had the sessions teaching you about depression. You haven't yet had the sessions teaching you about anxiety. You haven't yet had the sessions teaching you about post traumatic stress disorder. So all of these come throughout the course, and you have clients throughout the course. But the client that you have, uh, there's no guarantee that you've had the lectures and all the training to cover the problem that that individual client comes into the therapy room with. And you might get lucky and you might have done. It might be that, the week after you've just learned about depression, a client walks in and says, I'm depressed. And you're thinking, great, that's fresh in my mind. This should be much easier. But it could be that a month before you learn about depression, a client comes in and says, I'm depressed. So you don't know what the problem of the client is. You have to, when it's your turn to do a therapy session, you have to walk to the university entrance. You meet them at the university entrance. You can make small talk or whatever between the university entrance and the room that the session takes place in, but you're not allowed to ask anything or do anything that probes about what the problem is that they're presenting with until you get in the room. And so when you're in the room, you sit down opposite the client. You've got an instructor who's got their notepads, and they're marking you and scoring you and making sure you do the correct job. You've got 3 students who are going to be in the same boat as you at some point during the day. So 4 of you across the day take it in turns to take the hot seat as a therapist. And then when it's not you being therapist, you're one of the 3 students who's watching on as someone else is in that hot seat. So obviously, if you go first, you obviously get it out the way, which is good because you then can relax for the rest of the day watching everyone else's sessions. But at the same time, you haven't got any ideas from, if you go say last, for example, you might get stressed from the fact that you're going last and you're just kind of in your head thinking, oh, I hope I get everything right. But at the same time, you can watch what everyone else is getting wrong and watch what they're doing right, and you can learn from the other students' mistakes and what have you. up to that point where you're now doing it. So it's something that can be quite anxiety inducing. And so I spoke on one of the streams, obviously, about the fact that I knew panic attacks obviously don't, you're not going to die from a panic attack, or not from the panic attack itself. And so I would just say to the client, these three are staring at me. This instructor is staring at me. They're judging me. They're marking me. If I do a bad job, I know that I fail this course, which I've spent thousands of pounds on. And so if I end up having a panic attack and passing out on the floor, because these are all therapists, they'll be keeping you company, they'll engage with you. And as soon as I come around, I'll finish the session. And then normally people would laugh. And I've then essentially said, I accept the worst case fate of what could happen here. So it takes the power out of that fate. So rather than worrying about it and worrying, oh, I hope this doesn't happen, I hope I don't have a panic attack and end up like hyperventilating and then passing out and all the rest of it, rather than worrying about all that, about a possible thing that could happen, it's accepting it's a possible thing that could happen and accepting, and if it happens, well, I'll just come around after I've had my panic attack. I'll just come around and I'll finish the session. There's nothing I could have done differently. That's what I'll do. And obviously that's largely the advice that you get in most areas of life. Like, for example, when doing work where people are attacking you with knives and bottles and baseball bats, and they're being relatively violent towards you, and there's a high risk that that's going to happen when you walk into situations, you just work out, okay, so let's assume it's going to happen. What will I do about it? What is going to occur? So you stop worrying about it because you think, right, I've been there, done that, planned for if that happens. Now I can just crack on with my life. If it happens, I know exactly what I'm going to do, so I don't have to worry about it anymore because I already know what I'm going to do if it happens. And so obviously everything I've done, that's always been my kind of strategy, has been plan for the worst so that you know what's going on, and then what you're going to do if it happens, and then you just crack on with your life. And obviously there are tips for diffusing panic attacks. Like one thing that it confuses me, a lot of people try and teach that if you're having a panic attack, try and control your breathing, try and do deep breathing, etc., and try and relax, and all these, so people will say, "I'll just breathe," and that's generally bad advice. The kind of way of dealing with it best is normally to go with it and to accept this is how your body wants to react. But instead of trying to force your body to breathe in, say, a calmer way, try and breathe every bit of air out of your lungs, and then just keep trying to breathe all of the air out of your lungs. So instead of trying to sort of go and trying to control your breathing and do deep breathing, just try and go and see if you can breathe every last bit of air out of your lungs. Because when you do that, your body instinctively wants to gasp in air, and so that starts to re-trigger your breathing to start being deeper and normalizing it. Ellen's talked about exactly what I've just said. Yeah, and there's a lot of research around kind of daydreaming or zoning out in lectures and things, that the students that do that, it's odd that teachers have a go at students when they do that, and yet students who zone out do better than students who don't. Because, assuming you're paying attention, that is, because the students what happens is you zone out and you daydream more, you access the REM state more when you're learning. So if you're learning lots of new stuff, you're going to zone out a lot because your brain is constantly you're going inside and having your brain think, right, let's update what's going on in here. So whereas if you're constantly trying to learn, but someone keeps saying, pay attention to the front, and someone keeps trying to draw your attention back, they're actually making you less likely to learn. They're kind of ruining what you're doing. Um, I'm sure someone will answer the question about Eastern Standard Time, because obviously I have no idea. All I know is it's 7:30 UK time. Don't know times in other zones. In theory, this should end up about Dr. Erickson, but I'm still trying to work down to the bottom of the live chat comments. Kind of irritatingly, there's normally so many that it takes me ages before I can start doing anything to have gone through all the comments. Either that, or I have to just start and kind of write off everything, a bit like debt. Just try and write it off and hope you can move on. I've missed a whole bunch of them, but I'm going to keep scrolling down anyway from where I'm at. Because it jumped down, and so I'm just skipping a load. Yep, I'm always saying that. Don't talk so that I can get to the bottom. Don't post new questions or new comments at all. Well, 7-11 and 3-5 breathing obviously is kind of the same purpose, whatever someone chooses to call it. But that is what I would always recommend with people, to make sure that you're triggering the parasympathetic nervous system. We talked about this the other day, where we talked about longer out breaths triggering the relaxation response, and so you want to be encouraging and doing longer out breaths rather than kind of having just normal breathe, in and out equal. And you don't want obviously the out breath. And then someone had mentioned about how they'd noticed their heart rate is faster on the in breaths than the out breaths, which is true. We talked about stories yesterday. If I don't like people, how did I meet my wife? I was working and someone who fancied me brought her along to meet me. And I said to that person, I like your friend. Is she single? Can I meet her? So that's how I met her. So yeah, so I've got obviously my Milton Erickson t-shirt on. Everyone obviously has a Milton Erickson t-shirt in their among their clothes. If you don't, something must be wrong with you. I have a coffee and a water. Let me put them both in the same place so I can access them. So obviously I've been a fan of Erickson since being a teenager. And as a teenager initially, I kind of thought, who is this Erickson guy that everyone keeps saying, oh, don't bother with his work. It's not really worth checking out. And that used to confuse me, because in the neurolinguistic programming books that I would buy, they would rave about this Milton Erickson guy. And in the hypnosis books I would buy, they would dismiss this Erickson guy. They would say, oh, Milton Erickson has contributed to the field of hypnotherapy, and then they'd move on. And it used to confuse me that books that said that they're not really about hypnosis seem to be happier with him than the books that didn't. So I started kind of learning a bit about him. When I decided I was going to work as a practitioner and have my own hypnotherapy practice, I contacted every single hypnotherapist and neurolinguistic programmer who was listed in the Yellow Pages at the time for my local area. So it was a Portsmouth Yellow Pages, but I was going for all the places that were in the Bognor Regis area, and nearly every single hypnotherapist and neurolinguistic programmer who I contacted agreed to meet up with me and talk to me about how they set up their business, how they got clients in, all these sort of things, which was really kind of them. And almost every single one of them told me the same thing when they heard that I liked the work of Milton Erickson and had done a lot of studying around his work, which was, oh, forget all that rubbish. That's just too confusing for anyone to understand. What you want is to get yourself a bunch of scripts and buy Dave Ellman's book, Hypnotherapy. That's all you need to run a hypnotherapy practice. And so I kind of was actually given a copy of Dave Ellman's hypnotherapy book. I was given a copy of that by one of the hypnotists, because when I said, that doesn't really sound like me, he said, look, I'll give you my copy if it will make you forget about all of this Milton Erickson stuff. He said, I've got a book of Milton Erickson's work, so not one of Milton Erickson's books, which was not that one, but that's in my way at the moment, and I can't find a home for it out the way. It can go there. Which was that one. The guy had this book on his shelf, Ericksonian Approaches, a comprehensive manual, which is an okay book, and he obviously had this book on his shelf, and he said, I'll give you my copy of this, which I didn't own because it was £35, and back in 2001 or whatever this was, I didn't have £35 that I could spend on a book. So I got given this book. He was trying to say, don't worry about the Erickson stuff. Just, sort of poor little young lad who thinks that he's going to do therapy in the style of Milton Erickson. It's too confusing. Don't do it. There's no need to be that confusing. Just stick to a folder of scripts. And he had his folder. I'll put that there for now. He had his folder, sort of big, thick, sort of clip boundy, I don't know what you call it, folder thing, full of hole punched bits of script that he kept under his chair. And he would have post-it notes stuck onto the different bits and pieces and onto the different sort of pages based on what clients he was going to have in that day. And he said, so all you do is, say a smoker comes in, you greet that smoker, you talk to them kind of, what would you like help with? I'd like help to stop smoking. Oh, okay then. And then you have a little chat with them, and then you say, okay, take a moment to close your eyes and we'll do the hypnosis. They close their eyes, and then you pull your folder out from under your chair, you turn to the post-it note you've got stuck in on the quit smoking script, and you read it to your client. He said that is all a hypnotherapist has to know how to do. If you can do that, you can make a living out of this. And he explained how the house that he was living in and the office in his back garden, he explained, I got all of this out of being a hypnotherapist, and all I do and all I've ever done is pulled out my folder of scripts, read the script to the client, and then sent them on their way. He said, I get one new client roughly every 6 months or so. I keep clients for weekly sessions for about a year or so to 3 years per client. He said, you don't really need much turnover. People will keep coming back and they'll see you weekly, so it's not a problem. And so I said, well, what happens when you've read your quit smoking script? If you're seeing them literally 52 times a year, what happens when you've read that script and they come back the next time? You can't just read the same script again. And he said, well, you just have a bunch of scripts that you cycle round through, and you just do like a different induction each time. So you have a bunch of different inductions, and normally they zone out and they don't really know what script you've read them anyway. So you sort of suggest amnesia and stuff like that. And so I thought, and I'd met a lot of hypnotherapists at this point, and this was just representative of what they were all doing. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound like the kind of hypnotherapy and the hypnotherapist I'm likely to ever be. Um, where's the focusing on a client and paying attention to what the client's unique way of responding? And all these therapists were essentially just saying to me, no, 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 that's not how hypnotherapy is done. Hypnotherapy is you hypnotize the person, tell them not to have their problem, and hope that they come back next week to carry on paying you. And you do that, and then a year later or so, they drop off from your books, and you've got someone else who comes onto your books. And that's what you do. You just have that nice steady turnover of one client in, one client out every year. Um, and to me, this seemed inadequate. So I took his book because he gave it to me, and then I ignored his advice about ignoring Erickson and carried on studying and learning about Milton Erickson. Yeah. My view is that ideally, a therapist should, as far as possible, start not using scripts at all, and that any training they undertake, you want it to be that if someone ends up looking at scripts at some point during their training, it's because they want to get ideas perhaps around how they might word something, or what kind of metaphors they might choose to use, things like that, rather than it being, I want to read a script to a client, or I want a script for X, Y, and Z. This is something that annoys me, for example, on my hypnotherapy studies group, where sometimes someone will say, does anyone have a weight loss script, or does anyone have a script for this, or does anyone have a script for that? Because the whole point is that those scripts are then essentially totally ruining the point of the therapy. And I've often argued, you don't get counselors saying, does somebody have a script for this type of client that I've got coming in? You don't get psychotherapists saying, does somebody have a script for this type of client I've got coming in? You don't get social workers saying, does somebody have a script for this client? No other profession seems to rely heavily on reading a sheet of paper. And yet the field of hypnotherapy seems to have this tendency that and I've talked about this before in relation to when I was a teenager, nobody in any other profession seems to do that, and yet in hypnotherapy that's quite common. And it's almost like somehow hypnotherapists, again, obviously not all hypnotherapists, but the ones who rely heavily on scripts and who think there's got to be a script for everything, it's almost like somehow they believe that it's magic, and that it's about that exact wording that that incredible person who wrote that script book had written down on paper. And Milton Erickson famously spoke about how he used to write out 50-page scripts, and then he would sit down and go through the 50 pages worth of scripts that he'd written for that one client for the next session that he's going to have with them. And he would figure out how to condense everything, all the information that's in the 50 pages into something that's 25 pages. And so he'd then write out a 25-page version that has all of the information that was in the 50-page version. And then he'd write out, he'd halve it and write out, say, 12, 15-page version based off of that 25-page version. And then he'd keep doing this until he has all the information that was in the 50-page version contained to a single sheet of paper. And Erickson would talk about how by doing this process early in his career, he was able to then put on paper everything that had come out of his previous client session that he'd had with that client, put everything on paper about what that client needs to get from therapy for the next session, all the stuff that's relevant to portray back to that client, etc., all that stuff. All of that was in the 50-page script, and then all the way down to that 1-page script. And so Erickson would say that what that meant was that he had learned a lot about that client and a lot about why he was putting all of this stuff into the scripts. And he would start off with okay, let's try and portray everything using this 1 page. But if something came up that meant he needed a part of, say, the 50-page script, he knew, oh, I just need to say that word, that bit in that way instead that I wrote down in the 50-page script, because right here, right now, talking to this client, that's how it needs to go. So he wouldn't read it to the client. He wouldn't sit there staring at a piece of paper, reading to a client, but he learned that this is kind of how you put all of your thoughts about that client session down. And a good therapist would likely do a similar-ish process, not necessarily writing an entire script, but would come out of a session writing down client notes, writing down bits about, okay, here's some observations I made about their body language, about the metaphors they used, about the problem and the pattern of the problem that they described, about the solution and the pattern of the solution. Here's thoughts I had around everything that came up. Here's my thoughts that were coming up during the session that I would have liked to have done, but obviously the flow and the time didn't allow it. And so I want to cover these bits perhaps next time if it's relevant. Here's the bits that I think wouldn't have been relevant to cover now, but will be relevant to cover next time, perhaps, or ask questions about or follow up on. So a good therapist would obviously be writing all that down anyway. And I've got notes of mine where you can go through it and you can see everything, all my kind of observations written down so that I can kind of get a helicopter view of them. I can look down on them and try and work all of this stuff out and think, right, so let's piece that together with that. And oh, there's a pattern there that I didn't notice, but I'm just writing my observations down. And then I can look for patterns within my text afterwards. Or I've written down, maybe they kept clenching a fist or something. And so I'm thinking, is there something I can do with that? It happened at these moments during the session. It happened in line with these specific bits of information. Is there a way that maybe the clenching of the fist could be turned into a task or turned into a metaphor that could maybe like a story or something that could be used, maybe to release that tension or something? So, that is kind of good practice. That's not then reading a script to someone. That's you've written down a bunch of your observations directly for that one client. And then the next session, the session could go an entirely different way, and none of that's relevant for what comes up in the session. Or it could go kind of similar to how you expect it to go, in which case you might use some of your ideas that you've come up with, but you always prioritize what's going on in the here and now with the client, not what you've got written down. And what I was learning was that actually there's an awful lot of hypnotherapists who don't do that, who literally, I've attended dozens and dozens and dozens of hypnotherapy courses with different trainers in the UK. And I would say probably 75% or more of those training courses have given course handouts that are largely script based. Largely, here's a folder full of the scripts that you can use when you're practicing. Here's a staple bound booklet of scripts for you to use. There's only a handful of courses that I've attended where that isn't the case, where the focus is on, okay, watch the client, observe the client. And there's obviously a difference between a script and having maybe a bit of a structure jotted down. So especially with new therapists, I always recommend having things like regard jotted down on some paper as a structure for therapy sessions, so that you obviously, with regard, I'll mention it for those who don't know in just a moment what it is, but with regard, it's not that you necessarily follow it like I've got to start at the top and work my way down. It's that this stuff is what you're going to include within the therapy session, and it's kind of mix and match. There's points where you're doing multiple bits of it at once, and there's some bits that you're doing all the time and things like that. So regard as a structure for doing therapy stands for rapport building, information gathering, goal setting, agreeing a strategy, accessing resources, and then doing the rehearsal, so mental rehearsal. And so having it written down, if you're a new therapist, is really handy because it helps you to make sure that you're following those points, make sure you're definitely going to cover those bits and pieces. because sometimes it's easy for new therapists, especially, to get drawn into the story that a client's telling them. And if you get drawn into the story, obviously you're then likely to lose track of, I didn't access their resources, or I didn't kind of work out what the strategy is for the therapy, or we haven't really established a clear goal, or I've been so focused on just the story, I've not really been focusing on whether we've got a rapport going here. So it gives you that kind of structural process. And obviously, once you start doing lots of therapy sessions, like most things, it's kind of becomes more instinctive, and you just are doing, you cover it all anyway. But you still should have regular observed practice. It doesn't matter who you are, whether you've been doing therapy for a month or whether you've been doing therapy for 20 years. You should still have observed practice. You should still have other therapists watch you do therapy, who can then feed back on the therapy you were doing, and feedback on whether you're doing things like, did you stick to regard, for example? Did you sort of hit all those points? Were you doing therapy as perhaps you should? And getting honest feedback from other therapists. So, and other things that I have gone into sessions with written down. So again, it's not a script, but it is written down. Are things that I might go in with to make sure I've got clarity in my mind, especially with cases where I'm thinking, I've been a few sessions in now and this person doesn't seem to be getting better or making any progress. What am I doing wrong? And so I'll go in perhaps with things like the basic emotional needs written down, so that, again, I make sure I'm definitely going to check out for these, ask for these if I realize it hasn't cropped up in the session, and just see where this person is in relation to that. So doing that is obviously one thing. Having a script, obviously I showed some the other day, but having a script, like obviously I've got lots of script books behind me. This is Scripts and Strategies in Hypnotherapy. But having a script where you're essentially going to be given something that you just read through page after page is, let me try and put that back in its home, is obviously not a way to work. That's that's not client focused. That's not paying any attention to clients. So a lot of people mistake what, so we'll sort of move on to Milton Erickson himself in a minute, but a lot of people kind of mistake Milton Erickson in terms of when they talk about an Ericksonian approach. I've heard people who think of it as hypnosis. I've heard people who think of it as a therapy, when it's obviously not hypnosis or a therapy. It's a way of approaching how you do things. So if you read through all of Milton Erickson's work, of which he wrote a vast amount of things down, and obviously there's all of his demonstrations, there's loads of video footage of him out there teaching and demonstrating therapy. There's even more audio stuff out there than there is video stuff, which you can listen to, that has, in his own voice, him teaching sort of how to work therapeutically. And what you end up, and then obviously there's all this written stuff, like pretty much everything on that shelf and that shelf is written by Erickson, or just a transcript of Milton Erickson. Everything that he kind of focuses on is about his approach to doing therapy. It's not about the therapy itself, and it's not about hypnosis. It's the kind of mindset that he would take to it. So Milton Erickson's therapy, in terms of any kind of therapeutic approach, he would always say he developed a new therapy for every single client. When he was asked, what therapeutic approach do you use? He was adamant that using a psychodynamic kind of approach, as he had been taught initially, as a psychiatrist wasn't really a suitable approach. That uh, it might get some information, but it doesn't move people forward necessarily, because you're not asking what someone wants to achieve and then practically going about achieving that. You're focusing on the past, which has already happened, and you can't change it. And so he would find that he'd get much better results if he just kind of thought, well, what is it you want to achieve instead? What has to happen for you to achieve what it is you want? And how are we going to make sure you can do that? And so it's all very kind of solution focused. So lots of therapy, different therapy models sprung up from the way Erickson approached doing uh, therapy. His therapy was very much around focusing on the individual, and where they're at here and now, rather than where they were at in the past and what went on in the past. So when you read a lot of his work, or read work, or listen to the listen to the audios by other people, what you end up finding is that other people seem to misunderstand him. So there's interviews with Jay Haley, who was someone who's written about Erickson and was a sort of celebrated therapist in his own right. The interviews between Jay Haley and Milton Erickson have Jay Haley asking things like, so tell me, Milton, how do you treat this kind of condition? Erickson would then say, I had a client come into me and they had this problem, and they presented in this way, and they did that, and they did that, and they did that, and then I did this intervention, and then they got better. And then Jay Haley would say, so where was the hypnosis in that? I didn't catch where you did the, okay, now take a few moments to close your eyes and do hypnosis. But to Erickson, the whole thing was, it's not so much about hypnosis, it's about doing therapy. And it's his kind of, he'd always be trying to get people to understand, at least in like the audios, it definitely stands out. This does. He's always trying to get people to understand his way of approaching the world, rather than it being about the therapy itself. So he was a psychiatrist, a medical doctor. He had tons of medical training and obviously psychiatric training and experience. His therapy, in part, was obviously based on all of that training. And no one else has exactly the same training and what have you as Erickson did. If you were a medical doctor and psychiatrist, then you may well have a lot of similar training, but you're not going to have had Milton Erickson's own personal experiences that he brought to the table as well. But what he did within that, and this is why I always sort of say it doesn't matter what your therapeutic approach is, you can be Ericksonian and have whatever that therapeutic approach is, because the Ericksonian approach is about making sure that with curiosity, you're using observation, utilization, and having a goal. And if you're doing those three things and you're being curious in terms of doing those three things, you are doing an Ericksonian approach. So it doesn't matter what therapeutic modality you use, whether you say, right, I'm a solution focused therapist, I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, I'm just a normal, just a counselor, Rogerian counselor, whatever someone wants to describe themselves as. You can be that and be Ericksonian. The Ericksonian part is, are you treating, coming from a client responsive perspective, are you putting the client at the heart of this session that you're having, or are you putting a therapeutic model at the heart of this session that you're having? So are you focusing all of your attention on, right, my model says that your problem happens like this, and so it doesn't matter what the client says, you try and say, no, you've got to fit my model, because what you're telling me doesn't fit my model, so you've got to tell me what fits my model, and I'm going to treat you based on what fits my model. That's then not being Ericksonian. Being Ericksonian would be, okay, so what you're telling me is X, Y, and Z, and so these are my observations, and this is how I'm going to use those observations towards that goal. So obviously it's very clear how to see that in terms of hypnosis. Like I talked yesterday about arm levitations, and you're going for an arm levitation, the person's arm doesn't move, so you say, or will you find yourself so deeply relaxed that your hand just sticks to your leg? And all you've done is utilized the fact their hand wasn't levitating. And so because their hand's not levitating, well, who cares? For them, clearly it's not supposed to levitate right now. And it even could be, because you don't know, there are cases where people's hands levitate in their mind. So you can ask a client, what went on. People don't normally ask their clients these things, but when you do demonstrations and you're practicing with people, you ask what their personal experience was. And they'll say, oh, it felt like my hand was like floating way up here. And you'll be thinking, no, I was watching you. Your hand was on your leg where it had always been. So their subjective experience was that their hand levitated, even though in reality it didn't. So you can't even rely on your observations necessarily to back up what it is that you're saying. You might be thinking, I failed. So the best thing to do is obviously talk about maybe the hand is so heavy it's just stuck on your leg. And if they've seen it levitate, they just think that's a comment thrown out there. It doesn't mean anything to them. But if the hand does feel like it's on their leg, they relate to it and think, oh yeah, that must be me. That's what's happened. My experience is. So in relation to Milton Erickson, there's tons of stuff that he has written. He's got his backstory, obviously. Some of you might know it, some of you might not. So Milton Erickson was a poor child, or in a poor family. Grew up on farms and kind of around nature a lot. He had a number of health issues, and one thing that happened was, as a teenager, he got struck down by polio, and a doctor came in, obviously, to see him in a bedroom, and said to his mum while he was lying on the bed, your son will probably be dead by the morning. And Erickson says, he was really angry about this. How could you tell a mother, how could, as a medical profession, how could you take hope away from a mother at a time when she needs hope? How could you say that to somebody like that? And he then asked if his room could be rearranged slightly so that he could watch, if this is going to be his last day here, he wants to watch one last sunset. And he obviously also thought, you're going to be wrong. And so he watched this sunset, went into a coma, and when he came out of it, he was totally paralyzed. And I think he could move his eyes, and that was about it. And life had to go on. Everyone else had to crack on, do the farming jobs, do everything that everyone has to do. So he would get strapped into a chair, his arms tied to the chair and what have you, so that he didn't sort of fall out the chair and slump forward or anything. So he was strapped into a chair and would have to sit there all day, staring out the window from sitting in this chair. And it was a rocking chair. And he talks about how one day he was sat in this chair and he started longing for being outside, and he drifted into a reverie, just desperately thinking, I want to be outside. I really want to be outside. I want to get out. I want to be out climbing the trees. I want to be out in the fields. I want to be doing this, that, and that. And then he said he opened his eyes and he was near the window. And then he realized that somehow, even though he was totally paralyzed, he must have moved. No one had come in and moved him. He must have somehow rocked the chair so that it gradually shifted its way forward across the room until he was at the window. And so this got him thinking, maybe, even though he's paralyzed, maybe through the power of his thoughts and his imagination, he can create movement. And so he talked about how he started looking at the back of one of his hands, and he started vividly imagining what it would be like to be climbing his favorite tree and reaching up and grasping the branches and dragging himself up into the tree. And then he said he saw a slight twitch on the back of one of his hands. And when he saw that twitch, he then thought, well, if I can get a twitch in the back of my hand by thinking about climbing, maybe I can get a twitch enough to move a finger. And so he kept on thinking and imagining climbing a tree until he saw a finger twitch. And then if he could get one finger twitching, his logic was maybe I can get a second finger twitching. And so he then got a second finger twitching and a third and a fourth and a fifth, until suddenly, he'd reached a point where he could now move his hands. And he got it so that he unparalyzed himself by doing this. But while he was sitting there, didn't have a lot to do. So he developed lots of his observational skills. He would try and work out who was walking to his room down the corridor based on the sounds of their footsteps. And then once he could identify who it was walking down the corridor based on the sounds of their footsteps, he started thinking, well, I wonder if I can work out how they feel based on the sounds of their footsteps. And so he'd then listen to them walk to the room and see if he could work out what kind of emotional state they were in based on how they were walking to the room. And so he started developing the thing he was probably most famous for, which is his observation skills. To help him to learn how to do things, he said he had to discover himself in the same way that babies do because of having become totally paralyzed. And so he watched his baby sister learning to walk. He watched the way that she would stand and try and stand grabbing hold of furniture, and then she would try and take a step, and then she'd fall over. She would do things like she would try and grab her hand with her hand, because she would see this hand in front of her face and obviously not know that that hand is her hand. And then she'd have this thought of reaching for it, not knowing that she's having a thought of reaching for it. And so she would try and grab her hand in the air as if she's trying to grab her own hand, but it's her hand that she's moving to try and grab her hand. And so he would watch and notice this behavior that babies do, that through trial and error, they begin to master, they sort of reach around and find out where their ear is in relation to their arm on the other side of their body. And so he was working all this out and getting all these observations, and then teaching himself how to do things, and the fact that people fail. So he was teaching himself how to do all these things based on watching his young sister learning to walk and learning to talk and what have you. But also noticing that all of this was done with multiple failures. He commonly said, if adults tried to learn to walk, if a baby tried to learn to walk with an adult mindset, humanity wouldn't walk. That if a baby tried to walk with an adult mindset, they'd fall over 3 times and give up. Whereas babies will fall over literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times before they succeed in taking a first step. Then they'll fall over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times before they manage to figure out how to lift the opposite leg off the ground and move that forward, how to have shifted all of their balance of their weight and everything to the other foot, and how to move all the right muscles to lift the leg off the ground, how to move that whole leg forward at the right way while keeping all the weight on the other foot, how to then transfer all that weight back to the other. That's a lot of stuff to figure out. Babies will fail hundreds and hundreds of times before they figure it out. And so if they were trying to do all this with an adult mindset, they just wouldn't even bother. And this became something that he would do as part of his therapy, would explain it's okay to fail. Failure doesn't mean that you quit, and doesn't mean that you are a failure. Failure is part of the process of learning. And then after Erickson had managed to get himself kind of starting to walk again a bit, he still needed to use a wheelchair, and he was due to go to college after the long sort of US summer break. And they said, look, just getting over polio, find an outdoor activity you can do, something where you can be out in nature. So Erickson ended up deciding to go canoeing 1,500 miles. And he was supposed to be making this trip with a friend. The friend pulled out. Erickson decided that it was best if he didn't tell his parents that the friend had pulled out, because if he told his parents, they might say, still using a wheelchair, not really capable of doing this journey on your own, not very sensible, you're not doing it. So he thought he would just do it anyway. And the canoe trip, again, something else that Erickson's very famous for, he wrote a diary of this trip. And when he started the trip, he couldn't walk without crutches and would have to spend time in wheelchairs and things. When he finished the trip, he was able to carry the canoe on his shoulder out of, sort of as he walked along. So he had gained a lot more use of his legs. He also, because he couldn't walk for especially a big chunk of the canoe trip, would do things like there were locks en route that he was taking. And so he was asked, how on earth did you navigate the locks? Because you couldn't open them yourself. You're on your own. You couldn't open them yourself. And he said he would drag his, he would sort of canoe up next to a bit out of the, to get out the water. He would drag himself up out the water and just sit on the lock and wait and wait and wait. And at some point during the day, eventually someone will come along and they'll say, oh, what are you doing? And he would say, I'm just waiting here for someone to open the lock. And then they would end up helping. So he started learning how to influence people into helping him where he struggled himself to do things. And I've got his, if I get it down from my shelf. I've got his canoe trip book here. This is a limited edition. I think there was 500 printed. Limited edition book of Milton Erickson's canoe trip. There's the actual copy of the manuscript. So that's Erickson's canoe trip diary that he wrote. And then there's the that one is the thing kind of all written up and typed up so you can actually read it. I'll tell the diet that's I'll talk about that in a minute. This has extra. There's Erickson. This has, obviously it's an Erickson book. This has extra bits and pieces in it. It has the route that he took for his canoe trip and a pop out bit there. It has other bits and pieces in here. His book plate that he designed and all bits like that. So he went on his canoe trip. That's what that book is all about. Let me just make sure that's all together. And I obsessed about wanting that book for so long, for years and years and years. I'd heard that that book was in the process of being created and that there was only going to be 500, I think it was, of them, or even less than that, maybe. I can't remember. But it was a very limited run. It might have been less than that. I don't know if it says it in them at all. Just seeing if it says it in here. No, I don't think it says it in there. But yeah, so I obsessed about wanting that for so many years, for the whole time that it was in production, that the Erickson's canoe trip had been like something of a legend within the therapy community for years and years and years. And then and it was told that Erickson had written a diary, and it was told that Erickson had given the diary to one of his sons, I think, but then the diary had gone missing. And then one day the diary ended up suddenly being found in a drawer. Someone just opened a drawer and there it was, Milton Erickson's canoe trip diary. And so all of a sudden it was like, that's got to be turned into something. And so yeah, there is a Facebook page specifically for the canoe trip diary. I can't remember who it was who did the editing. I'm just having a look. Just seeing if it does say. Yeah, in 2013, Betty Alice Allen and I think it was Louis Kaufman, who is the one that mainly got it out there. Let's have a look. Yeah, so it was some of his kids and I think Louis Kaufman who worked on it. But yeah, so for years I tried to get hold of that and then managed to, because I have this bizarre thing. It's like when the documentary about Milton Erickson came out. For like 5 years or something, I'd obsessed about wanting the Milton Erickson documentary, and the trailer would make me cry every single time I watch it. And I thought, this is a documentary about Milton Erickson, like a proper made, full-on, decent documentary about him. And it's going to be, because it's Milton Erickson, literally tens of millions of people are going to try and buy this on the day it comes out. And Abby kept on saying to me, no, Dan, tens of million people will not be trying to buy this documentary. And I'm like, well, they will. It's Milton Erickson and it's a documentary about him. Of course, tens of millions of people are going to be buying this. Literally anyone who knows anything about therapy knows about Milton Erickson and will be obsessed with wanting this documentary. And I'm going to have to order it the second they announce that it's going to go live. And that's what I did. I was refreshing, like you do when you're trying to get tickets for a concert or something. I was refreshing the page over and over again for hours, waiting for the second that they went live. And the second they went live, I instantly, Wizard of the Desert. The second it went live, I instantly purchased it and thought, I've managed to be one of those millions of people. I've managed to get in there first. At least I've secured myself a copy. On reflection, I do wonder how many people actually bought it, given that it never seemed to stop, never seemed to reach a point of them saying, sorry, we've ran out of stock. It's a bit like these books behind me. Each one of these volumes is limited to 500 issues. And so technically only 500 people in the world will have a complete set as a maximum. And you could buy them individually. So lots of people just bought individual ones. And again, that was something else that I thought I have to just get hold of it somehow, because so many millions of people are going to want to have what's kind of like the encyclopedia of Milton Erickson there. So many people are going to want that I've got to be one of them, and I'm going to have to get in there early. And I still see the occasional one for sale. So I don't think they've hit 500 sales of each single book yet. But what I do know is that out of those who do own them, I am one of the 500 that has the whole collection. And I'm sure there's not 500 people with the whole collection in the world. So I'm glad that I am one of those people that did manage to get it. But yeah, it's why did they print so few of them? I think it's because they're all books that have been available before in some form or another. And they're all kind of, they just wanted to create a special, like almost collector's edition version of all of Milton Erickson's work, which is what they are. It does annoy me if you look closely, which you might not be able to see on there, that the February Man, volume 9 there, is out of line with everything else. So that bit there, where is it there? That gold bit there, that whole title bit there that ends at a different line to all of these, and that kind of irritates me. That that one right in the middle isn't level with everything else. But I've got them all, so that's the important thing. Um, so yeah, so Erickson went on this big canoe trip, and all these life experiences obviously taught him about doing, um, how he became someone doing therapy. So he had a relative who put him through medical school. Um, yes, it is a very annoying thing. He had a relative who put him through medical school. He wanted to be a physician who would do much better than this doctor who said, "Your son's going to be dead by the morning." Who tells a parent that? He wanted to be someone who would give hope to people. Some other bits you saw there, the photo of him reading a really big dictionary. Erickson had lots of issues. He was possibly dyslexic, tone deaf. He didn't understand certain things that other people understood. I would suspect, although I've got no obviously evidence of this other than his writings and what have you, he kind of reads as someone who may well have been autistic as well, based on some of his ways of taking things literally and not understanding things until someone suddenly points them out to him, and noticing patterns everywhere, but not necessarily grasping certain bits and pieces of information. He was, I think I've probably said colorblind already. Colorblind, and one thing that happened to him was that he didn't realize the dictionary had an order to it. So whenever he had to look up a word, he would pick up the dictionary. So he didn't know how to spell a word. He'd pick up the dictionary, he'd start on the first page, and he'd read from that first page until he found the word that he couldn't spell. And it took him years until he said one day it was like a flash of light. He said he describes it as a blinding flash of light happened, and suddenly I realized that the dictionary has an order to it and that it's all in alphabetical order. And once he had that flash of light, he could understand the dictionary. He knew, oh, if I want to learn how to spell, run, I'll flick to the R's and then I'll find the word run. But for years and years and years, he didn't realize that the dictionary had this order. And what it did, though, was it meant that by the time he did realize it had this order, he had a tremendous grasp of the meaning of words. He would know how to use language in ways that many others didn't kind of realize or wouldn't necessarily appreciate. So he would be very specific in how he worded things, because he would know about like multiple meanings. He would know, well, that word means these 42 different meanings, and because it's got these 42 different meanings, I can use it in these 42 different contexts while emphasizing one of those contexts, so that that's the context that the person ends up picking up on. So a lot of and I've obviously talked about hypnotizing people with breathing. It's something that obviously all hypnotherapists practice and then do with clients. It's something I like to think all therapists do, that use your breathing to essentially hypnotize your clients. But he developed that because of the fact that he was watching someone sing, and he, I think I've mentioned this before, said, why is it when the person's shouting at the audience, everyone in the audience starts breathing the same as the person shouting? And his teachers said to him, no, that's rubbish. That's not what it's called. Singing for a start, and people aren't breathing the same as the singer. People are listening to the singer sing. They're not copying the way the singer's breathing. And so he started testing this idea, because he was sure that everyone was breathing the same as the singer who was singing. And so he started learning how to breathe pop songs, so popular tunes of his day, and he would sit next to people. He'd breathe the tune, and then he would notice that the person he sat next to would start humming or whistling the tune that he was breathing, as if somehow it was suddenly in their head, even though it was just him breathing it. And so this confirmed this is, people do this. People do pick up on the breathing patterns of others, and they do then internalize that as if it's somehow from within them, and that they would take credit for it. They would assume it was them. And I think I talked about it in relation to the Hypnotic Assassin novel, where you can do things like breathing the sentence you want someone to say to themselves so that they say it to themselves as internal dialogue, without realizing you're the one who was saying that sentence through your breathing. And he called it subliminal auditory stimulation, this idea of being able to influence people with breathing, and made it kind of a central part of a lot of what he did over the years, that he would breathe, as I would do. You sit opposite a client, you start breathing the same as them right from the minute you've met them, and you start then adjusting your breathing to suit what you want to be going on inside the person you're working with. So if you want them to relax more, you gradually start slowing down your breathing, deepening your breathing, relaxing yourself. Obviously, you are congruent, so you physiologically, slump your shoulders and things like that, so that you're giving off. It makes it easy. It's hard to kind of breathe calmly while being sat and stiff and upright or something. So you kind of let yourself go into that kind of relaxed state while you do it. How do you breathe the sentence? You breathe it as if you're saying it, except don't say it. So I just breathed the sentence there, which was, I'm breathing a sentence here. Um, a very original sentence to breathe to a camera. But yeah, so you just essentially, it's like breathing out bursts of energy, bursts of breath almost. So it's essentially saying it to yourself, but you're not opening your mouth. So you end up breathing it out while you say it. There are some interesting things like, this is a bit of a tangent, but I'm going to keep it very short, because it might be interesting or helpful to people. You can actually influence you can actually influence your internal dialogue by doing something as simple as biting your tongue. It sounds really stupid, but if you bite your tongue, that can make it so it's really hard to do internal dialogue properly. Because to do internal dialogue, as well as the fact that when you're doing internal dialogue, you are breathing the pattern of the internal dialogue, you're also, when you're doing internal dialogue, making micro movements, including moving your tongue in time with the internal dialogue, even though you don't necessarily notice it. So if you bite on your tongue and hold your tongue still while while your mouth's closed, it makes it very hard to do the internal dialogue because your tongue can't move to the internal dialogue. Well, that's very clever of you. No, it doesn't really take a lot of practice. Now, I know you lot are quite used to me saying things like, I don't really understand why people don't grasp it. And then you saying that it's just me that's grasping it, kind of thing. I don't really understand why people can't see people's breathing. It's one of the most common things on training courses that I teach is people saying, so how do you notice when someone's breathing? How do you see someone's breathing? Because I can't see when someone's breathing. And I think, how on earth do you not see when someone's breathing? If they're breathing, then their shoulders move up and down, their sides move in and out, their front and back, predominantly their front, moves in and out. You can see their nostrils moving in time with their breathing. You can often hear them breathing. There's just so much movement going on. I don't understand how people don't notice it. It's like the entire body is moving. Um, but people often say, "Oh, I've never been able to notice someone breathing," which kind of confuses me because it is such a big and obvious thing to notice. Um, yeah, just don't bite your tongue too hard. Yeah, if you're trained to notice breathing, then I think it's easier. Um, but with so there was an example. There was a situation. Abby and myself were walking along Bognor Seafront one day, and there was this guy slumped over, kind of in Bognor Seafront has like a wall that has benches indented into it. We're walking along the seafront. This guy was slumped over in the wall, and we passed this guy, and Abby said, "Oh, do you think he's okay? Do you think we should check on him and see? You know, he could be dead because he did look relatively motionless." And I said to Abby, "Well, his heart rate was probably about 60 or so beats a minute, and his breathing was probably about 5 or 6 breaths a minute. So I think he's probably okay and just resting or maybe asleep or something." Um, and so, whereas Abby saw him as totally motionless, kind of just slumped there, I saw him and could see his pulse in his neck. I could see his foot twitching slightly in time with his pulse, and could see his entire body moving in and out for his breathing. Um, and so, as I was approaching, I thought, "Oh, that guy looks stationary, and wonder if he's dead." And so as I got close enough to observe, I then just took a few moments to observe and try and do a loose kind of calculation of, you know, 10 seconds or so of trying to work out the pulse, and then probably 10 seconds or so just seeing an in breath and an out breath, just working out how long that was taking, and then trying to do rough maths in my head to see if that seems about normal. And was doing that in the time that I walked past. And so, yeah, so it's sort of interesting. I'm aware that sometimes I notice things that others don't necessarily notice. Um, but yeah, so other things, for example, Milton Erickson wrote a paper where he talks about subliminal auditory stimulation. And he talks about something I mentioned yesterday, which is the case of the two doctors who said, who one of them said, "Oh, my child has said that you were breathing the person to sleep," and Erickson confirmed, "Yes, that's what I was doing." And Erickson talks about how children often notice, but adults don't when you're doing these techniques. Um, so that's in that article on subliminal auditory stimulation. I think it's in the same article where he talks about his experiments with deaf people, where he wanted to know how deaf people lip read. And people were saying to him, it's not just lip reading, it's kind of the face, the neck, the throat, it's kind of everything that you're reading. And he set up an experiment where he had the deaf person looking at a person who was looking at a blackboard. So they could see the person kind of in front of them, facing them. They couldn't see what was on the blackboard beside them. And then that person would read what was on the blackboard just in their mind. And the deaf person had to guess what it was that person had just read in their mind off of the blackboard. And he found that some deaf people were incredibly capable of being able to be very accurate at reading the internal dialogue of the individual who's reading the blackboard in their mind. And so Erickson then obviously started practicing and learning how to do this, so that you're essentially throat reading almost, and reading the lips, the micro movements of the lips. So you're reading the breathing pattern, you're matching the breathing pattern to like the movements of the throat and the lips, to know what the person is probably saying to themselves in their head. And suddenly you can then come across as a mind reader because you're looking at someone and you know what they're saying, because they're talking in their head, they're giving away micro movements that if you've learned to read them, then you can pick up on this stuff. This is something, I don't know how many of you might know this. On my current YouTube channel as it stands, some videos I never deleted from my channel is a series of, I think, about 60 videos, each one being about 30 seconds long. And each of those 30-second videos is me reading a random paragraph from a random book on my shelves. But I'm reading it in my head. So I spend about 15 seconds reading that paragraph in my head. And then I read what I've just read in my head out loud. And the idea was that I have it in a playlist, on a YouTube playlist. And so for ages, I would have that on shuffle. And so I wouldn't know which video is going to come up next. And every video looks the same because it's just me sat in front of my books. I don't know what book I'm reading from on the camera. And so and they're all high definition. And so the idea was that I would then just have this playlist of me, and I would have to watch my face and upper body. So similar to what you can see here, I'd have to watch that, and I'd have to work out what it is that I'm saying in my head. And then obviously 15 seconds later, I say what I was saying in my head. And then I think, yes, I got that right, or no, I got it wrong. And I recorded them all back to back. So the lighting, how I'm dressed, everything is identical. So I can't kind of think, oh, I've got used to the videos, I know this one is that video. And so that was my way of practicing doing this, was to see myself and just start trying to learn from watching my own face, reading different things, learn how to read my own internal dialogue if I watch my face on something, so that I can then start to learn better how to do that with clients and with other people, so that you can be talking to someone, and when they're talking in their own head, not to you, you've got a rough idea of the kind of thing that they're saying to themselves, and whether it's about you or not. So I found that there are downsides, though, to learning to do this, because there are some things that people say to themselves in their head that you just really didn't want to overhear. And so it's even more incentive to then not look at people and not obsess about like studying them that closely at times. But any therapists out there watching this, that's definitely an article that I recommend you check out, is looking up subliminal auditory stimulation and checking out Erickson's article on that. Yeah, well, the idea of it was that you want some level of control over how you're practicing. So if I just had like a friend, I could easily get a friend and say, what I want you to do is say things in your mind, and then I'm going to try and say what I think you've just said in your mind, and then just tell me whether I'm correct or not. Or read something just in your head, and I will then tell you what I think you've just read. The difficulty with that is that you don't know exactly the words that they're using. You don't know if they've just been honest with you. You hope they have, but you don't know necessarily if they've just been honest with you, in case you've read them perhaps and they're now really uncomfortable with the fact that you've obviously read them and got it right, and so they now tell you got it wrong. And so I just thought, well, all I really want is literally a head and body in a controlled kind of environment where I can't tell the difference between one and the other of any of the videos. And I know there's a clear structure. Something gets read, and then it gets read out loud, exactly as it was read in your own mind. And I can blow it up on a TV screen, and so I'd watch it on a TV. I can blow it up on a TV screen, and literally sort of looking at this giant Dan head in front of me, I can start to notice kind of what's going on. Whereas just practicing face to face, again, you're doing it in real size, not able to blow up on a large TV screen and do it on a big screen. Um, yeah, so obviously biting the tongue thing is good information, but at the same time, you don't want to actually end up one day spitting out a chunk of your tongue because you've bitten actually into your tongue and through your tongue. Um, but yeah, so that article I think is a really good one to read. Ernest Rossi often recommends Milton Erickson's article about the burden of responsibility in therapy and how to put that responsibility back onto the client for the therapeutic success and the therapeutic outcomes, that the client is the one who has to be the one making the changes, not the therapist. The therapist is helping and supporting and keeping the client on track, but the client has to actually be doing the work. If the client isn't doing the work, obviously nothing is going to change, so they need to be doing the work. And so Erickson wrote an article about this, about the burden of effective psychotherapy, or the burden of responsibility of effective psychotherapy, where therapists will blame themselves and think, what am I doing wrong? Why can't I fix this person? When it's not your responsibility necessarily to fix people, it's your responsibility to do what you can do within your skills and abilities. But it's the client's responsibility for the actual therapy, and it's it's sort of separating the two out, saying if you're not doing your work correctly, then obviously you need to pull yourself up on that. If you're not putting in 100% and doing the best you can for every client, and you're not keeping up with continuing to learn and practice and develop as a therapist and all those sort of things, then obviously that's where you need pulling up and that's what you need help with. But if you're doing everything you can for a client, but the client is never doing anything for themselves, yes, there's an element of one of the things that maybe you should be doing, that you want to check that you're doing, is that you're working to try and help the client get to a place where they can make the changes. But at the same time, ultimately, the changes won't happen until the client decides that they're going to make those changes. It's sort of, it's not going to be that the therapist goes and does it all for them. And so Ernest Rossi often talks about that as being a really important article for therapists to read. When I started learning about Milton Erickson, people kept on saying to me, "Oh, he wrote almost nothing down. There isn't really much work of his out there." And yet, all of these black books are obviously Milton Erickson, and many of them are his collected papers and things. So he didn't write many actual books, but he wrote a lot of papers, and a lot of his stuff is based on curiosity. So it's based on him having an idea or having an observation and thinking, I'm really curious to explore this and figure out more about it. And he didn't do a lot of referencing other authors, which people weren't overly happy with him about at times. People would raise the fact that other researchers would obviously reference other researchers. They would say, building on the work of these people, and you'd reference within your journal article other researchers who've done bits and pieces that relate to what you're talking about. And Erickson's reply was, I don't want to be doing what other people are doing. I want to be doing my own thing. And so his lack of referencing, in his opinion, was that it was because everything he was doing was his work and his contribution and not someone else's or based on someone else's. So he does do some referencing, but not very much referencing. And part of the difficulty with that is it doesn't then necessarily put it in a broader context. So with most papers, you can pick a paper up, you can kind of get an idea of the argument that the author's making, an idea of what's led them to the plan of making that argument, some of the opposition to that. You can get all of that from the paper and the references to all of that. So it sits in context with everything around it. And I think one of the things that's probably not helped Erickson's papers to spread wider is they don't necessarily fit in a context with anything else that's kind of around the outside of it. Have some of my cold coffee. Obviously, in all these streams, I end up having my first sip of coffee an hour and a half after I've sat down. Anyone would think that I'm having an ultradian dip. I don't have any cookies or biscuits or anything with me, though, to do that. And the coffee's too cold for a dip. So with Erickson, the bit that I'd want people to kind of think about, if you're a therapist, in terms of if you wanted to know about Ericksonian therapy, is not thinking about therapy, but instead just thinking about an Ericksonian approach, thinking that it's not about the therapeutic. It's not about like a model of therapy. It's just about a way of approaching doing therapy. So nowadays, I would say nowadays, most therapists out there who do good, effective therapy, I would describe, if I watched their practice, I would then say, you are an Ericksonian therapist, essentially. You are putting your client first. You are making your client the center of the therapy, not some arbitrary model of therapy like cognitive behavior therapy or psychodynamic therapy or whatever other form of therapy. You're making your client the center of the therapy, and then you're using what's right for that client and what fits for the client. You're not saying, well, the client has to fit my therapy. And so you're doing your therapy. So someone who's cognitive behavioral trained will do different work to someone who's, say, psychodynamically trained. But what you're doing is you're doing it through the lens of observing the client and using the client's responses towards the goal, rather than so for example, it could, if you, one way of looking at this that kind of almost proves the point to some extent is to look at the difference between, so for those of you who have watched therapy sessions by these therapists, look at the difference between, say, the way that Richard Bandler do therapy, the way that Steve Gilligan would do therapy, the way that Ernest Rossi would do therapy, the way that Jeff Zeig would do therapy, the way that Bill O'Hanlon would do therapy. You look at all these different people and the way that they do therapy, and you notice every single one of them does therapy in a very different way, and all of them are Ericksonian. It's just that their preferred kind of routine is a mix of observing and utilizing what the client brings to the table, but also observing and utilizing what you bring to the table. And in my book, just to flash one of my books, in my book, Hypnotherapy Revealed, the Ericksonian Approach, both my hypnotherapy books I was very proud of. They don't get many sales, but I'm very proud of them. In my book, the Ericksonian Approach, I go into the fact that the observation utilization stage isn't just really narrow. It's not just focused on, well, I've observed that the client is breathing this way. I've observed that the client is using these words. I've observed that the client is using these metaphors. It's not just about that. It's what else is brought to the table in terms of you. What are the observations? Literally broadening that out to as wide as you can imagine. Where did the client live? What kind of age are they? What kind of upbringing do you think they had based on that? What kind of what's your way of working? So if you're someone that's very kind of bullish and very forceful, then the observations about yourself are, I am a bullish, forceful therapist. I just dive straight in. I'm very loud. I'm brash. Whatever you are as a description, that's your observations about you. And then, those observations about you would mean you're not going to do therapy in a way that's not you, because then you wouldn't be authentic, and then you wouldn't do good therapy, and you wouldn't do therapy that is your kind of way of doing therapy. You'd be trying to be someone else, which isn't, Erickson always said, don't try and be me, be yourself. He would always say he didn't want people to come to him and attend his teaching seminars and then go away thinking, I'm going to pretend I'm Erickson from now on. Cool. So your own observations about you are, this is me, this is who I am, this is how I am when I'm doing therapy. And your utilization of that is, I'm going to use myself how I am. I'm not going to try and be someone else when I'm doing therapy. So you're taking all that in, and this is my learning as well. So this is the type of learning I've had through my life. This is my experiences through my life. So I choose certain types of metaphors when I do my stories. I choose certain types of metaphors and certain just things that resonate with me. It's normally nature, and it's normally like there's a lot of water. I quite like water, so there's a lot of like being at an ocean or a lake or a river or something, because I like that. So there's a lot of me within my stories. Someone else might have entirely different things that interest them, and a lot of their stories might well match the metaphors and what have you that come from the client, but they would do a completely different thing. So if we look back at that's the list from the last live stream, sleep meditation live stream, of which, remember, there's a next one's tomorrow night. If you look at that, someone else creating a story out of that would probably come up with a totally different story to the story I came up with, because they're a different person. They've got a different set of things that are important to them, different, upbringing, different mindset around certain things. And it doesn't mean they've done it wrong, and it doesn't mean that I've done it right, and it doesn't mean that I've done it wrong and they've done it right. It just means we've both done it different. There wasn't a right and a wrong. There was just two different ways of doing things with the same content. And so it's kind of, that is the important part of an Ericksonian approach. It's not saying one form of therapy is wrong and one form of therapy is right, and you must do things this way and not do things that way. I'm not a loud kind of in your face person. That would never be my therapy. And unless I really, really, really thought it was the only way to help that one client, I'm very unlikely to ever do that as a form of my way of doing therapy. It might mean that certain clients don't just gravitate towards me, just like my way of teaching. Might mean that certain students don't gravitate towards learning from me. But then you'll get other people who do gravitate towards it, who do think, oh, I like the fact that he's calmer, he's more relaxed, he's more measured, he takes time over things like his wording, he puts a lot of attention onto trying to be thorough about this, that, or the other, whatever it happens to be that someone thinks. Those people would hopefully gravitate towards me and then like what I do, and that's fine. It doesn't mean one's right and one's wrong. And that's kind of the point with the Ericksonian approach, that when people talk about wanting to learn, and I still get it, even when I tell people this, the people I tell still say to me, so this is the Ericksonian approach. And they still talk about it as, so I get people who will say things like, so then how would you use Erickson? I don't think Ericksonian therapy would work with someone with severe depression. And then my thinking is, I don't understand. What do you mean you don't think Ericksonian therapy would work with someone with depression? Ericksonian therapy isn't therapy. Ericksonian is, an Ericksonian approach is taking an approach to how you do therapy. there is a lot of scientific research about what works at helping to treat depression. There's a lot of, you can do evidence-based practice, and there's a lot of stuff there around that. Milton Erickson doesn't come into that at all. It just isn't a logical argument. But I do get that now and frequently, even from people who have literally just had me say what I've been saying here, which is that Ericksonian approach is not therapy. It's a kind of way of approaching how you do therapy. And it's getting that kind of thing across, that I think if you read a lot of Erickson's work, not just NLP books by people like Richard Bandler and people who knew Erickson, but then it's their version of what they think Ericksonian approach is. Or you read, say, Ernest Rossi's work and you look at his stuff, or you read Jeff Zeig's work and look at his stuff, or you read Steve Gilligan's work and look at his stuff. When you read any one of them and you think that person, that's the approach is that, you kind of miss the approach. You're now drawn into, for example, so many people say to me, the Ericksonian approach is all about indirect hypnosis, when it isn't remotely about indirect hypnosis. Milton Erickson would be indirect and Milton Erickson would be direct. In fact, people have said, oh yeah, but in his later life he was always indirect. But if you watch the videos of him in his later life, he still says, close your eyes, do this, do that. He still is just giving instructions like he always had. There were some bits where he would add in indirect stuff, and he would do a lot of priming using indirect techniques. So priming is essentially, for those who don't know, is essentially getting an idea across before you need it. So you're giving an idea to somebody so it's ready for them to action it. So, for example, if you want someone to do an arm levitation, 20 minutes earlier, you might tell a story about being in school and being desperate to answer a question that the teachers asked. And, you got your arm up and you're waving it, trying to get the teacher's attention. And then you're trying to push your arm up even higher, trying to get the teacher's attention. Or you may tell a story about being a child trying to get something off the top shelf. So you'll do something where you're talking about arm levitation so that the person has the idea of arm levitation already within them, primed and ready to go. So that when you then ask for an arm levitation 20 minutes later or so, Erickson used to say that it takes about 20 minutes for the ideas to sink in to start to become active. When you've given those ideas, you end up with the actual suggestion when you give it being accepted easier, because the kind of neural patterns around that are already set up. They've already got an idea that this is what's expected of me. And they don't necessarily know that you've done that. They don't know that your story about getting something off the top shelf was actually because you're going to be trying to get an arm levitation in 20 minutes time. And obviously I do that a lot in my sleep meditations. I do a lot of priming things, and I'll talk about things in a certain way earlier on in the story so that when I get to it later on in the story, hopefully it makes more sense and it's easier to access and do, because I've already mentioned that it's going to be coming up. Books and things do this. They do things like foreshadowing and revealing stuff that's coming up later in the book. For the therapists out there, Milton Erickson taught his students, so this is long before the 1970s, so this is back when he used to teach, back in the early days. He used to teach his students 2 ways to begin to learn how to recognize or learn to develop your skills as a therapist around recognizing patterns and recognizing sort of the client that's in front of you. So he used to say that a client in front of you is a bit like the last page of a book. There's an entire story before that client that you don't know. All you've seen is the last page, that what's presenting here and now. And then all you hear when the client first starts talking to you is what they say, based on this last page of the book. So what he would do, I'll just pick any old book up, just so I've got something in my hands while I do it. He would say, read the last page of a book. Okay, the last pages of this book are all blank. Read the last page of the book, and then try and think, okay, how could this story have ended, so of a novel or something. So don't do this with novels you actually want to, like your favorite authors or anything. Do this with novels you're using specifically for training purposes. So you read the last page and then you think, right, how on earth could this novel have ended up here? What story has to have happened for this to be the last page? And then you write down lots of your ideas. So you write down like, someone, this must have happened there and that must have happened. And you write down just, obviously not the entire story, but like as if you were going to say a kind of rough plot or a paragraph describing the story. So you write that down. Then you read the second to last page. If anything on that you've written down now just would never happen based on that second to last page, you cross it off. If you've got new ideas based on the second to last page, you write those down. And then you do it to the third to last page. And you work your way from the last page backwards through the book until you get to a point where you're very confident that what you now have written down is what the rest of the book must be, what that whole story must have been to get to where you are. And so that way you end up, obviously, the more you do it, the better you get at it. The better you get at recognizing, those patterns are there and these patterns are here, and the wording there meant that must have happened here. So you get better and better at recognizing this kind of information. So he used to say to trainee therapists that if you do that and you start getting the habit of doing that, what you're teaching yourself is how to have the last page of something and know how it got there with as little information as possible. So eking out as much information from as little kind of information, if that makes sense. And so the same in hospitals. You've got to get used to, obviously Erickson came from a medical doctor background, where you had the same thing. So he tells the story about taking students to around the ward and to the different beds and saying, what's wrong with this patient in this bed, without looking at the notes, what's wrong with this patient in the bed. And he talks about a time where different students were saying, well, I think they've got this wrong with them, and I think they've got that wrong with them, and they were completely wrong. And then Erickson pointed out the patient didn't have any legs, and not a single student had noticed. And Erickson said that whatever you do, whether it's medical doctor or psychiatrist, just check the obvious, because sometimes the obvious just isn't there. And if it's obvious, you don't bother checking it. So he said, look at a person. Do they have 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose, a mouth? Do they have 2 arms, 2 hands, 2 legs, 2 feet? Just check them out. Never mind how stupid it sounds, there'll be people who don't have these things. And so that was his kind of point to his students, was that they can spend so much time looking at the top part of the patient, because everything else is under a cover, looking at the top part of the patient, trying to diagnose, thinking, well, maybe their skin looks a bit pale, so maybe they've got this problem, or maybe their cheeks look a bit flushed, so maybe they've got that problem. And they never actually just think, okay, before I try and diagnose, I'm going to just scan down them. Do they have 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose, a mouth, shoulders, arms, hands, legs, feet, etc. So he was a big one on, even if observations should be incredibly simple and straightforward, make the observation on purpose anyway, because you want to be certain, not just assuming that everything's correct. Yes. So the other one was to do with the reverse, was read the first page of a book and try and work out where you think the story is going to go based on the first page. Then read and write it down your ideas. Read the second page, cross off all the ideas that now just don't work based on the second page, write down any new ideas you have. then read the third page, do the same again, cross off all the um, bits that now wouldn't work, and add on new ideas that you've come up with based on that. And again, you just get better and better. Yeah, everyone check your limbs now. You just get better and better at then knowing how based on the start, how it's going to end. So they were the two things Erickson kind of taught in relation to a book as brilliant things for therapists to do. Now, my suspicion is I would do it because I'm obsessive and weird, as people have often told me in my life. I don't know many other people who actually take time to want to improve their performance by doing these kind of things. And yet, these are the sort of things that will help you to improve and help you to improve your observation skills at being able to look at information. So Jeff Zeig talks about when he was learning from Milton Erickson. And while he was learning, Milton Erickson received a letter, and Milton Erickson said, "I'm not going to work with this." Yeah, Erickson said, "I'm not going to work with this client," and and Erickson said, so Erickson said, "I'm not going to work with this client," and Jeff Zeig said, "Well, you've just read the letter from them. Why are you writing them off?" And he said, "Well, because they won't get better." And Jeff said, "But how can you be sure they won't get better if you've never met them?" And Erickson said, "Well, because they've given it away in the letter that they will not get better from my therapy. So I'm not even going to waste my time on doing the therapy with them." And Jeff said that he was this kind of cocky, optimistic, young trainee therapist who said, "I reckon that I could help them get better." So Erickson said, "Okay, you take on the case, your choice." And they took on the case. Jeff took on the case, and he said, after I think a couple of years or whatever, he went back to Erickson and said, "You were right. They didn't get better. How did you know they weren't going to get better?" So Erickson dug out the letter and what have you, and said, "Read the letter again." And they read the letter and said, "I still don't understand. How did you know?" And he said, "While I was reading, I noticed that every time they said a positive, the next sentence was a negative. And when I got to the end of the letter, if you gave +1 for every time they said a positive and -1 for every time they said a negative, the net result at the end of the letter is 0. They had no intention of getting better. They would constantly undo any work that they do." And I could tell that just from reading the letter. So I thought, well, not worth working with them, not at this time. So there are bits like that you end up, you learn your observation skills and end up being able to. Most therapists, I like to think, would still probably think, "I'm going to work with them anyway." But Erickson was at the end of his life and very busy and could turn work away because he had more people wanting to turn up and see him than he had time to see people. So he could turn people away. But it's things like that you just get used to noticing. Like, is there a pattern there going on? And it might be that because you've noticed a pattern like that, when it's happening in the therapy session, you're then going to address the pattern in some way. You're going to look at how you can move them into a new pattern before you even start focusing on the getting better part. You need to get them to a place where they're going to be willing to make improvements, or a stage before the actual therapy almost. So there was something I was about to say, and it was based on something I read. There are quite a number of biographies of Erickson, of different kinds, and biographies in books as well. So a number of the books written by people like Ernest Rossi have sometimes a reasonably substantial biography section in them. But there are things like, just having a look. There's a play, Rubin Battino, wrote a play. If I can get the light off of it. That's right, is it not? Which is a play about the life of Milton Erickson. So if I had people here, maybe I could then read it as a play. I doubt I would ever actually do that. But yeah, so it's just written as a play, as you can see. Or possibly not, I don't know. So yes, that one's a play about Milton Erickson's life. Milton Erickson Lives is another kind of biographical-ish thing, but it's based on an interaction of knowing Erickson. Jay Haley wrote a book about Milton Erickson. Jay Haley on Milton Erickson. Jeff Zeig wrote Experiencing Erickson, which is kind of biographical about Milton Erickson, and then obviously a transcript as well in there. So there's with the advent of the internet, this isn't you can find Erickson videos all over YouTube, but before the internet, this book, which is another biography of Milton Erickson, which is definitely a very highly recommended book in my opinion if you want a biography of Erickson, written by his kids, includes a DVD. And back in the days when I was buying Erickson DVDs, they cost, so the reverse set DVD, some of you may have heard of it. The reverse set DVD, you can now watch the video on YouTube for free. The DVD of it is a 30-minute DVD, and I bought it as a VHS. So this is going back to the dark ages. I bought it on VHS, and it was like £75 on VHS, and it was about £150 on DVD for a 30-minute tape of Milton Erickson. So buying this book gets you a DVD of Erickson doing a clinical therapy session that's 32 minutes and 55 seconds long, for what I think was about £15. It's $21 this book costs. And something I found interesting, this talks about the work that Erickson did with Aldous Huxley as well, which that's something that I really wish hadn't been destroyed. Aldous Huxley had a fire. There was a Californian fire that ripped through, sort of forest fire that ripped through his property and destroyed all of Aldous Huxley's notes, and so Milton Erickson only had his own notes to work off of, but they were exploring consciousness together, Milton Erickson and Aldous Huxley, and they'd been having lots of regular meetings exploring consciousness, both writing up their separate things, and they were going to write a book together based on their exploration of consciousness. And the only thing that exists now are a brief write-up of Milton Erickson's notes, but that's mentioned in here, among other. It is in other places as well, but it's in here as well. There's Milton Erickson, so that's a sage counseling book, so that's about Milton Erickson as well. So again, some of it is kind of about his life and stuff, but then it also, because it's a counseling book, it goes into teaching about the kind of techniques as well. I'll try and get these back up here. That's about hypnotic language, seminars. Erickson. I think there's some other ones somewhere, but yeah. So there's in terms of biographies, and Wizard of the Desert is obviously a very good documentary to watch about Milton Erickson. That's kind of biographical and has lots of unseen video footage in it, which is good. Yeah, do the play myself with all the different voices. Now I saw or something. Yeah, you could always start with a short story or something rather than an entire novel. I don't really read fiction, but then if you're reading fiction in terms of doing it as a study, you're not really doing it as reading fiction. You are reading fiction, but you're reading it as part of your learning your therapy skills. Turn away therapy. Yeah, I obviously turn people away, but that's because I don't like taking people on nowadays. Um, yeah, if you don't want things to get better, then they won't. But also, that's why Erickson wrote things like his article about um, the burden of effective psychotherapy, and how most therapists place all of that burden on themselves rather than accepting that when a client's ready for therapy, that's the best time for them to be in therapy. There's no point a client paying a therapist. So Erickson, despite his fame, taught charged his same modest fee regardless of what point in his career he was in. Even at the end, he would say, I charge this much an hour. And for his teaching seminars, he apparently would say, I have this hourly rate. That's just my hourly rate. If 20 of you are in the room with me, you divide that hourly rate between 20 of you. It's as simple as that. Whereas nowadays, including if I run a course, there's a chance that I'm just going to be thinking it's this much per person rather than it's this hourly rate that I charge. And then you get your group, however many turn up, you just divide that hourly rate by yourselves. Yes, it's a shame that I am too young to have known Ericsson. Yeah, I think some people obviously do need additional help, like therapeutic help, because even if you want to change, sometimes it's hard to the example I gave the other day that I said I used to give to parents, where I talk about how it's like fat drunk men screaming at a TV a football match as if they know better than the football player does. When actually, if they were on the pitch where the football player is, they would probably not even get the ball, let alone get anywhere near the goal with it. Um, and that parenting challenges are a bit like that, where the parent knows their situation. They're the expert, like the football player is the expert. It's just that they're so busy trying to keep everything together and keep the ball at their feet that they can't kind of get that view, that sort of external view or helicopter view or whatever on themselves to know where they could make a change or which direction they should turn. Whereas if, say, the football player had an earpiece, the person in the earpiece who's up in sort of looking down on the pitch could say, there's someone to pass to, at 4 o'clock or something. And then the person would know, right, I've got to kick the ball to 4 o'clock. So you could then, you can get their support for you to be able to do your job that you know how to do. It's just that you don't know, you don't know how best to apply your skills. So the football player knows they can pass if they knew that they had an opportunity to pass. It's just that they're being chased by lots of people and they've got the ball. And if they start stopping and thinking, best stop now, take time to look around and see what I can do, they'll lose the ball. I can't think of what I'd ask or tell him. I would just learn. Yeah, most people probably don't have enough Erickson at ready reach. I often end up giving away Erickson books because I end up with more Erickson books. Um, so people immediately in my life, whether they like it or not, end up getting libraries of hypnosis and psychotherapy books, including Milton Erickson books, because I acquire things. For example, I recently, middle of last year or something, saw on eBay, because I search eBay and all these places very frequently, I saw on eBay that there was someone, I think in France or something, selling a box of therapy books that they'd retired, and they were selling off their entire box of therapy books all in one lump. The postage wasn't too bad. I think they were asking for something like £50 or something. So it was incredibly stupidly cheap. And I think including the postage, it was about £60 or £70 or something. So it was stupidly cheap. Some of the books that were in this collection cost that amount of money if I were to buy them on their own. And I remember sort of saying to Abby, I've got all these books that are in this collection, but I don't have these copies that are in this collection. So, for example, I had a copy of My Voice Will Go With You. And I've got the new copy up here. I had a copy of My Voice Will Go With You. It's a paperback copy from, I don't know, 2002, 2003. I bought it while I was doing training back then in Ericksonian hypnotherapy. And the copy that was in this collection was the hardback copy, which obviously is much older and a much nicer copy. So I gave away my copy of My Voice Will Go With You because I now have a hardback, much better copy. If I can get that back on my shelf. So there's lots of books like that that were in the collection that it was like, oh, I've already got this book, but I've got like a more modern paperback version and I'd rather have that one. I've still got, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of the originals in this case. Oh, that has to go back up there. I've got all the paperback. These are brilliant books if you haven't got them in your collection. I've got the paperback collection of the seminars, workshops, and lectures of Milton H. Erickson. All very good books. All easy to read. Quite a chunky lot of books. But I've got that in paperback. One thing that was in this cheap collection of books that I got from the internet was, I put these back, if I can get them back in there. The 3 released hardback copies. So I've also got the 3 released hardback copies, which cost a lot more. But I didn't want to give away those paperback ones. And those are also those 4 there as well. So those 4 there are those same ones there. So I've got 3 copies of those books. Um, so I end up with multiple copies of these different books, and so I just try and find anyone in my life who seems remotely interested. Um, Generally, in my life, because I don't really have friends much, that many friends, it's generally a case of are you sure you really, really don't want to learn about Milton Erickson? I've got some books. Are you sure you really don't want to learn about hypnosis? I've got some hypnosis books on the floor here, for example, that are on the floor so that I remember they're not part of my collection anymore. With the intention of when I find someone who wants them, I'll just give it to them. And if I don't, then they'll go to Oxfam or something, because they don't need to be on my shelves anymore. Um, so yeah, it's not often you see good bargains on things like eBay, like I've managed to stumble across. But I did end up, for example, getting. I've got an old version here. I think I showed this the other day. I've got this book, which is an old book, which shows you nothing, reveals nothing. Suggestive Therapeutics by Hippolyte Bernheim, which is one of the coolest names out there. Smells very nice and is from 1880. So this is Hippolyte Bernheim's Suggestive Therapeutics from 1880. It's reasonably rare, reasonably expensive, smells very nice, and is a bit delicate. What I got in this collection of books was a modern day version of it. Modern as in it's from like the 1980s. A modern day version of it that is now my reading copy. So I've got the sort of, in this one collection of books, I've got a reading copy of that one that's up there, and I've got an 1880s version of it over there. So yeah, the number of books I end up just giving away to people like that. But I don't think enough people have or pay attention to Erickson books that they should. But at the same time, I don't want people to treat him like a god. I talked the other week about this in relation to conscious and unconscious mind, that I had commented about how there is no such thing as a conscious mind and an unconscious mind on my hypnotherapy studies group in answer to someone's question some time ago. I think they'd said, oh, what should we call it? Should we call it the unconscious mind or subconscious mind? I think this was kind of their question, because a lot of hypnotherapists call it the subconscious mind, but I've heard people call it the unconscious mind, and especially Ericksonian people call it unconscious mind. And as all of you here are largely Ericksonian, this is in my group, I'm just wondering what we should call it. And so I had replied saying, technically both are wrong. There is no such thing as a conscious mind, an unconscious mind, a subconscious mind. Forget all of that in terms of actually believing it. None of it's relevant. There are things you are consciously aware of. There are things that are unconscious processes, and there are things that are non-conscious, so that you are not currently conscious of, is obviously all that means. There is no such thing, though, as an unconscious mind or a conscious mind. And I'd had this conversation kind of a number of months later. I met with Adam Eason, and I was having this conversation with Adam Eason saying, there's a technique in hypnotherapy, conscious unconscious dissociation technique. But so you can talk about conscious mind, unconscious mind as part of doing the technique, but you know that you don't believe a word you're saying, because you know that it's just a concept to make the technique work. And so in normal situations, unless I'm teaching it, and when I'm teaching it, obviously I get to say the caveat that what I'm saying is wrong. It's just being used for demonstration purposes. But it works so well, saying, talking about the unconscious, when actually there is no such thing as the unconscious as such. But it does work really, really well as a term, and people kind of understand what you mean often when you say it, even though it's not strictly scientifically true. So yeah, so I think you don't want people to become dogmatic about it either. So I think people should read Milton Erickson's work and learn from it, but you don't want people to end up then revering him to the extent that they think what he says is 100% true. In the same way that if you read his, wherever these books are, um, his papers about attempting to cure people of being gay, hopefully you also don't end up buying into that and thinking, oh, well, obviously that's right, that therapists should make people straight. Hopefully you wouldn't buy into that in the same way that you don't buy into other mistakes of that Erickson made. I sort of think that in relation to a lot of things, that people seem to revere heroes and believing that heroes can do no wrong and that heroes are almost perfect and or are perfect, and then they don't like to hear things that contradict with it, and they kind of dismiss. It's a bit like, I'm a PlayStation 4 player and I couldn't care less if someone plays an Xbox or a PlayStation. I just generally prefer PlayStation, but it makes no difference to me. But you get the people who are like constantly, I'm an Xbox gamer or I'm a PlayStation gamer, and I'm, the other one is bad and evil and it's, poorly made or this, and when the reality is they're just different consoles. Who cares? So yeah, so it's as much as I want people to read about Erickson's work, I don't want people to then find, because some of it is incredible and some of it is so interesting, like when you hear his stories of his upbringing, his life. Obviously I haven't even touched on half of his treatment things that he's done, like obviously the treatment of the girl when he was working in the psychiatric hospital, the girl who would smash up her room all the time, and so he'd agreed with his staff that he was going to go into her room, rip the radiator off the wall and smash her room up when she's in the middle of having one of her kind of rages of doing the same behavior. And he was going to keep going until she was begging him to stop. And that way he was then sort of externalizing her behavior through his behavior, making it so that she's now saying, don't keep breaking everything, rather than staff saying to her, don't keep breaking everything. Things like the person who believed that their feet were so big that they were really ugly, and then he intentionally stamped on their feet and started having a go at them, saying, if you didn't have such attractive feet on you, I never would have noticed them, and then walked onto them or something like that. And then you've got things like the woman in pain in the bed, and he agreed with the daughter that she was happy for him to lift her, this back in like the 50s or whatever, lift her skirt up so that her thigh was showing, and then slap her thigh really hard. And so the daughter walked into the room and sat down in view of the mum, and then Erickson walked in and lifted up her skirt and then slapped the daughter's thigh really, really hard. And the mum leapt out of bed, ran across the room and attacked Erickson. And Erickson said, how much pain are you in now? And she realized her pain had disappeared, because her focus was so much on attacking Erickson that she'd forgotten about the pain. So it hasn't even got into talking here about the different interventions he's done, the ethics of them, and whether some of them would even be allowed nowadays, some of his interventions, what you can learn from the different interventions, what led him to the conclusion of making certain interventions. You've got things like the person who was agoraphobic and said that they would pass out being outside. And so Erickson walked outside with them and said, are you going to pass out here? And pointed to the ground. And they said, no, actually, that's probably a bit hard. You probably want to pass out on the grass, maybe over there. And they'd walked a bit further, and they're considering where to pass out, and says, or that bit of grass over there looks probably better to pass out on, so maybe you want to pass out over there. And said, but actually down there a bit further, there's grass that's just out the way, so if you passed out there, no, you wouldn't be in anyone's way, so you could pass out there. And the person was considering where to pass out so much that they ended up forgetting that they were now outside and hadn't passed out, and now actually were feeling okay. So yes, there's all these different kind of tales from Erickson's life, like um, the one with the girl who wanted to commit suicide and believed that she was ugly and unlovable and what have you. And so Erickson made her promise that she wouldn't commit suicide while she was in treatment, and then said, what are some of the things that are bugging you and annoying you? And she said about this guy who was so annoying, who was always around her, and that he obviously hates her because he's always there pestering her and being annoying to her. And Erickson's take on it was, she obviously like this guy obviously likes you, and his view was that he felt that she seemed to like him based on the way she was talking about him, even though she was saying he was annoying. And she was saying, well, no one would like me because I've got this ugly hole gap between my two front teeth. That's probably why he's always there, to pick on me and make fun of me because of the gap in my front teeth. And I can't be loved. No one would love someone as ugly as me. And so Erickson said, well, if you're going to kill yourself anyway, you've got literally nothing to lose um, by getting him back. So next time you're at the water cooler in your work, get some water in your mouth. When he comes over pestering you, squirt some of the water through the gap in your teeth at him, kiss him on the cheek, laugh, and run away. That'll teach him for his behavior of constantly pestering you. And so he then said he had her learn, practice squirting water through the gap in her front teeth until she could hit a target with that. And then one day after that, and the one thing that she felt was the thing that made her ugly and made her suicidal, the sort of main focus of all of that was this gap in the teeth, which Erickson had turned into the strength, the kind of, the central focus of this love was the flaw almost. Another similarish case was Erickson's one where someone said, I'm ugly, no one would ever love me, because of this giant sort of spot on my face, this kind of pimple or mole or whatever on my face. And Erickson sort of wanted to test this theory. He said he didn't want to test it, but he told her he wanted to test this theory and said, I think that men actually find it really attractive and would treat it as a beauty spot. And I think if you go in to kiss men, like when you're greeting them, if you're going to kiss men when you're greeting them, I bet that more men will kiss the mole, kiss the mark, than will kiss the other cheek. And he knew that the way he'd worded it, she would want to try and prove him wrong. So she would turn. She believed that it was ugly, so she would turn the mole and believe that no one would kiss it because it was ugly, and it would stop them kissing her. And all the men kissed her where the mole was, and she ended up seeing it as a beauty mark and not as a sort of a negative anymore. Then there's obviously cases like the African violet, Queen of Milwaukee, where there was the woman Erickson was teaching in Milwaukee, and he was only going to be there for like a day or something. He was asked, while you're there, can you pop in on, I think it's like My Auntie or something, of whoever it was. She's deeply depressed. She isolates herself. She doesn't go out, mix with people. She is religious, but doesn't sort of mix with anyone in any community or anything. Would you go and see if there's anything you can do to help? And Erickson's response was, I'm only there for a day. I'll see what I can do, but I'm literally only going to be there for a day, so I'll pop in on her and see if there's anything I can do. And he popped in on her, and she allowed him in, and he walked around her house, and he noticed that she had some African violets, and that they were so well looked after that. And he knew, being someone that was into gardening and farming and everything, that they're incredibly difficult to look after, and as she was. And so he said to her, would you just do one thing for me? Anytime that a birth happens in the village, in sort of wherever it was they lived in Milwaukee, in your sort of local church or whatever, anytime a birth happens, just give one African violet plant to the family to say, congratulations on the birth. Anytime a death happens, give an African violet to the family to kind of say, sorry for your loss. Anytime a wedding happens, give an African violet just to say congratulations on your wedding. And the woman died like 40 years or something later, known as the African Violet Queen of Milwaukee, in the sort of paper's headline, where it talked about her being the most outgoing, wonderful, kind, caring woman, this loving, bubbly person who everyone got on with, who she got on with everyone. And she had stopped being depressed because all of a sudden that one intervention got her out there mixing with people. She had to get her basic emotional needs met. Essentially, she had to tend to the plants. She had to actually do clippings of the plants, grow them in new pots so that she had enough to then be able to, so that she would then be able to give these plants to others. And the intervention was literally to get her to give people plants. So there's lots of kind of interventions we haven't even touched on. Some are in, well, they're all in all the books, but they're in different books. Some Erickson has written about himself in these sort of books here. Then others are transcripts of Erickson talking about them. But these can end up making people become quite sort of enamored with Erickson. You read some of them, and some of them you think that's so crazy, that treatment that he did. Others you read them and think, well, that's obviously logical. So like a couple, he had the in Phoenix, he had the husband and wife separately climb Squaw Peak and go to a botanical gardens, and then they had to the next day swap over and do the same again on their own. And then the third day they could, if they could agree on somewhere to go, they could both go to one together. And they decided they wanted a divorce. So that was his sort of couples therapy, was to find out what they wanted as a couple. And what they wanted was to separate. Because obviously not all relationships, the aim of therapy isn't always to have people stay together happily ever after. Sometimes it's happily ever after apart. To give people perspective on things, he would often send them climbing mountains and things. A board game group. So there's there's so many cases of Erickson that are fascinating to kind of learn from and look at how he came up with these ideas, and they're all perfectly logical when you look at the case in more detail. So anyone who is interested in Erickson's cases and reading more about them, a very, very good book for that is An Uncommon Case Book. An Uncommon Case Book has, it's compiled by Bill O'Hanlon, has pretty much all of the cases that Erickson talked about in all of his own work. And every single one tells you, so for example, I've just turned to a random page. There's a pain case here. So 17-year-old woman, 4 children, dying of cancer of the urethra, severe pain, taking large doses of narcotics. And she didn't want to spend her last days in a narcotics semi-stupor. And so her doctor called in Milton Erickson. In one 4-hour session, Erickson taught her to go into trance, develop numbness of her body, and absorb herself in profound fatigue so that she could have physiological deep sleep despite the pain, enjoy food without gastric distress, and not have any more medication, and was able to then enjoy her time with her daughter. And so it then goes on to tell you the presenting problem, pain from cancer, the age group, it was an adult, the modality, so that was individual outpatient home visit, treatment length, it was 1 4-hour session, result, success, follow-up, she died, but the daughter said it had worked until her death. And techniques, hypnosis, and anesthesia, and then it tells you the sources, so you can find the full case information in the Collected Papers, Volume 1, page 284, Collected Papers, Volume 4, pages 256, 257, and Uncommon Therapy, page 299. So it then breaks it down to tell you which locations you can find Erickson referring to that case. And then obviously it goes on to the next. All these cases are pain cases. The next one, which is an 80-year-old dentist dying of prostate cancer. Then the next one is, it's the same one. Someone with a pain in their face. Someone with phantom limb pain. Someone dying of lung cancer. Someone with heart pain. Someone else dying of cancer. Someone with pain from a tumor on the side of their face. So yeah, and it then sort of goes on. But yeah, so that's a very good book for anyone who just wants to have access to all of the cases that Erickson talks about in all of his books. They're all in there, and then what you can do is the cases that you want to know more about, it tells you which books those cases are referenced in, so that you can then go and find those books and read those books if you want more details than what is in there. Hungry hippos. So yeah, there was things like, there's the, I think I mentioned it before, the Erickson working with the person who said, I don't want any hypnosis, but they were dying and needed to be relieved of pain, and their family desperately wanted, the family called Erickson in, and the family desperately wanted their relative to be free from pain. And so Erickson talked about tomato plants and how tomato plants grow with the person, and that's how he then stopped their pain. So yeah, so that's literally, obviously, what I was saying was a very brief summary of the summary that's in there. But yeah, I remember years and years ago, I think it was 2007 or something, Stephen Brooks had referred a mother who was dying of cancer and had severe pain, and she was trying to enjoy her last brief bit of time with her daughter. And unfortunately, I lived nowhere near them, so I was having to do the therapy over the phone. But it is some of the harder therapy to try and do, because you'll be on the phone to the person, you know that you're trying to help them to relieve their pain so that they can enjoy time with their loved ones before they die. But at the same time, you suddenly hear like a 5-year-old or whatever in the background running around and calling their mummy and things like that, and you're on the phone doing your best to help with the pain so that they can go and enjoy that time with them, but you know that ultimately they're not going to sort of be around to see that daughter grow up and what have you, and you kind of know that. And so I do think that it's the same, obviously, if you work in hospices and things. You kind of are aware of the impact that of sort of what the future holds a little bit for those situations. The book that just had the cases in that I mentioned, An Uncommon Case book. So it doesn't go into as much detail as Erickson goes into if you follow the locations. So if, for example, you follow the location to that specific case I just mentioned, if you follow one of the locations, because Erickson talks about it in different locations, each time he'll be using it as an example in wherever he talks about it, but he might be talking about it about a different type of context. Because a bit like me, I will use certain examples because they'll fit certain contexts of what I'm talking about from my own therapy practice, etc. And so what's helpful is people to see it in context each time. But I do have quite a selection of pain-based books, obviously. Just get that back. Part of the problem of doing this is I always spend all my time thinking I want all my books back exactly where they came from. Sometimes I end up at the end of a stream with a big stack of books next to me from what I've been going through so that I don't keep turning away from the camera. And then I have to put everything back in its place because it lives somewhere. But yeah, so there's a lot of, so in regards to pain, I've got things like the Hillgard's book, Hypnosis in the Relief of Pain. This one's signed by Ernest Hillgard, Josephine Hillgard, and William Kaufman. That's Hypnosis in the Relief of Pain. I've got their book, if I can get it out from there, Hypnotherapy of Pain in Children with Cancer. Books for dentists using hypnosis. I've got more pain books somewhere, but these ones are specifically together. Oh yeah, I've got a second copy of Hypnosis with for the Relief of Pain up there in paperback, but that's kind of the reading copy, and this one I just got off the shelf here is the copy that's signed and all that jazz. Yeah, I don't like spaces on the bookshelf. So yeah, so I've got lots of books on pain. I've got, if you go back to the very old days, I've obviously got copies, as most of you have seen, but I'm always happy to flash them again, of things like that book there. Smells very nice and old. That is Mesmerism in India by James Esdale. James Esdale did, this one's an 1850 copy. James Esdale did loads and loads of surgeries, things like lopping people's arms off and stuff, and other more sensible surgeries, I'm sure, under hypnosis. So this is talking about all of that and the surgeries that were done, how they were done. And it has nice random bits of newspaper clippings in it as bookmarks, which is always cool when you get an old book that has random old bits in it as well. That's one of my books that I keep in a little plastic container. Keep it away from the elements a little bit. Obviously, as there's a few hypnotists in the audience, so to speak, yeah, limb checks. One of my rarest books is that one there, if you can read it. Braid on Hypnotism and Braid on Hypnotism or Nervous Sleep. This book is Neuropnology. It's a first edition from 1843. Of James Braid's Neuropnology, which is obviously the book that started hypnosis. That's the book that James Braid coined the term hypnosis in. So that's for those who hadn't seen it previously. Obviously, I've also, as I've got my little bag in front of me, got this one, but this is a very delicate book and it will probably fall to pieces one day. That's my one from 1786. That's much harder to show because the pages are literally starting to fall to pieces, on mesmerism. Written by the Marquis de Puysegur. Just trying to seal this up again. Yes, Abby and myself regularly have conversations about what on earth is going to happen to my books if something happens to me. Like, where do they go? Who gets them? Because I want them all to stay together. And then I think I've shown before, there was this other James Esdale book that I've only ever seen listed for sale once in my entire life. And I bought it that once. Yes, I could smell all these books now. All I can smell is old books now. And that's Natural and Mesmeric Clairvoyance from 1852. And that's the only copy I've ever seen available for sale anywhere ever. And I made sure that I purchased it when it came up. But yeah, you really don't want to start me on seeing all my old books because or else I am here forever. Yeah, I like books and old books. I've recently inherited old family Bibles, which is quite nice. But yeah, so in terms of Erickson's stuff, obviously many of his students have written stuff about him and his work, and a lot of the work is 1970s-ish stuff. That's when many of the people trained with him. There are people like Jay Haley, who knew Erickson from before the 70s. But most of the people who wrote books on Erickson or in relation to his work based it on what Erickson was doing in the 1970s rather than like the 50s, 60s, etc. Ernest Rossi gathered up collections of Erickson's, and Jay Haley did, gathered up collections of Erickson's papers and bound them all together essentially into books. And I've got them all as their usual books, plus they're obviously among that collection there as well. Yeah, mine just have kind of the family names in of who's had it handed down to them. But it's quite nice having your own family ones. And I like old Bibles anyway. Yep, there was also Gregory Bates and Margaret Mead. There's some things I find very interesting. So a lot of my training has been in family therapy in that kind of context. And what always used to get me was that nearly all the training would talk about Margaret Mead in terms of family therapy and sort of anthropology and stuff. And yet it would never ever mention Milton Erickson. Just like nearly all of the therapy training that I've had would talk about Abraham Maslow in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and yet not mention that Milton Erickson, Maslow had contacted Milton Erickson and they'd had engagements sort of backwards and forwards about the importance of things like basic emotional needs versus focusing therapy on, because Erickson's thing was always about the here and now and things like that, rather than focusing it on psychodynamic stuff and focusing it on trying to identify a problem in the past and solving a past problem. And so I always find that interesting that Maslow crops up in the literature a lot. Erickson doesn't really. People like Margaret Mead crops up in the literature. Erickson doesn't. In relation to things like solution-focused therapy, people like Steve DeShazer, Insukenberg crop up obviously around solution-focused therapy, and even Steve DeShazer himself. I've got lectures of Steve DeShazer where he's asked by the audience, so is your work based on the work of Milton Erickson? And he says, no, it's not. It came out of the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto. Well, the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto, he would then say, oh, it came from people like Jay Haley, Paul Watzlawick, people like that. But they were studying communication that Milton Erickson was doing and how Erickson was doing his therapy. And so it kind of did come from that. But Steve DeShazer was very anti-hypnosis, and so he didn't want that association. And I've been hired specifically by the local authority into some of my roles because of being trained in solution-focused therapy. And yet I was trained in a far more kind of Bill O'Hanlon way of doing solution-focused therapy than Steve DeShazer way of doing solution-focused therapy. A lot of other staff were trained by Brief up in London and were trained in a very Steve DeShazer way. And I would start talking about things like Milton Erickson, and they've never ever heard of Milton Erickson. And then I'd be kind of saying, well, he got it from MRI and they got it from Milton Erickson. So you should know about Milton Erickson because that should be part of your training. And they've not been taught it. I don't know if they teach it now, but going back, because I haven't encountered someone who trained with them since 2015. But going back to then, it used to surprise me that Erickson is kind of, because of his association with hypnosis, is kind of wiped from the records almost. And this is what I found with a lot of people who I've met, that Erickson has contributed to strategic therapy, family therapy, solution-focused therapy, all different therapies. But himself, he doesn't kind of crop up. He was consulted by Gregory Bates and Margaret Mead to look at trance dancers in Bali and helping to identify which of the dancers are in deep trance, which aren't in deep trance, what it is you have to do to recognize that. And Erickson talks about how he helped them to decide, how he helped them to be able to know how to identify which dancers are in a deep trance and which aren't, and for their study. So a very interesting book on a lot of that is The Letters of Milton H. Erickson, Volume 1, which implies there's going to be more volumes. There just hasn't been yet at all. And that talk, Erickson kept copies of the letters he'd sent as well as copies of the letters he received. So that has both kind of sets of the dialogue. So you can then look and see his, the request from, say, Jay Haley, from Margaret Mead, saying that Gregory Bateson had suggested that she gets in touch with him. They're doing this trance project, and then Erickson replies, and so you can see his reply, and then she replies, you can see that, and then it sort of goes back and forth. And I think it's in that letter where Margaret Mead says, "Oh, I hear that you, Abraham Maslow said that you've been talking to him about, basic emotional needs, etc." I can't remember the exact wording of it. And so I was wondering if you'd be able to help us as well, because it sounds like you know a lot about these kind of subjects. So Erickson's kind of touched on all these different bits and pieces, but rarely gets the recognition from it that I feel that he should get. And I think part of the problem is because, for example, I was interviewed by Adam Eason going back a few years now. And at the end of the interview, Adam said to me, "You're the first Ericksonian hypnotist who's actually made it so that I might think of considering checking out some of Milton Erickson's work again," because he's very anti Milton Erickson's work. He feels that it's very unscientific. A lot of it's very unnecessary in terms of what's being done and how it's being done. um, a lot of the views portrayed about what Erickson thought, based on what the students say Erickson thought, portray this view of having a special state called hypnosis, um, talk about having an unconscious mind and all these kind of things. And so Adam's view is, don't even want to go there in relation to Ericksonian stuff. But obviously my take on it is that they're missing the point normally, these other people who've written stuff. And so, yeah, so it's kind of like, people write stuff and attribute stuff to Erickson that isn't necessarily, if you look at his own words, exactly what he meant in the context that he wrote it. And so then I think that doesn't help him, because it means that if you read a lot of like these books behind me here, which are all the clinical hypnosis type, journal article type books, Erickson's rarely quoted in them, which is a shame, because I'll be reading things and thinking this would be a good point to mention that study Erickson talked about doing. Even if it wasn't as vigorous and scientific as some of the other studies, it kind of reinforces that it's another example of this being the case like you're describing. And so I think that's happened in a lot of areas, that you end up with, like the family therapists don't want to bring in this crazy hypnotist that used to slap daughters' thighs to make the mothers jump across the room and lose their pain. Because it's like, we don't want that in our book, or in our courses. Erickson did things like the woman who said, everyone tells me I'm crazy, but I'm not. Just because I get followed around by all these naked dancing men doesn't mean that I'm crazy. And Erickson said, well, no one's in here is going to say you're crazy, as long as they don't get too close to my naked dancing women. And then Erickson agreed that he would allow her dancing men to remain in his office with them, as long as they didn't interact with his dancing women, and that she can visit anytime she wants to check that they're still there. And that if any more cropped up, she can send a manila envelope, and that will contain the new dancing men. And then those new dancing men, he'll just save them. And he said that she then, unlike before in her life, got a job, got on well in society, functioned perfectly fine. People didn't know that she was schizophrenic and had these hallucinatory sort of episodes like this. And every now and then she'd want to test that he's not, that he still believes her. And she would turn up at his office and want to look at her files. And she would, he'd open the drawer and he'd pull out all of her manila envelopes she sent him. And she would say, oh, good, you're keeping hold of them. I'm just making sure you're not just kind of ignoring them. And she would then leave and carry on with her life as if, so everything outside the room was still normal. And I've talked about this, about how before I even knew of that case, when I was a 19-year-old working in mental health, in mental health homes, about the schizophrenic woman who believed animals were trying to kill her. And I said, well, it's a good job that us staff have these big animal killing guns. Tell me where they are and I'll get them. And I started shooting with my animal killing gun around the room where she was telling me that they were. And I was saying, look, see, they're running out now. They're running out the door. They're terrified that if they stay in here, they're going to die. And she agreed, yes, I see them running out. I see them running out. And I said, shut the door behind them now. And she shut the door and said, good, you can see them at the window. You can see they're terrified to come in here. They'll never come in here as long as staff are in here, because they know we're all armed with these guns. And for the whole time, the 3 years or whatever I was doing that job, she never once had another episode of freaking out and getting absolutely terrified inside the home. She would literally start throwing things at the animals that she could see, and start smashing the home up towards the animals that she could see, and cowering in corners and screaming and crying at all times of the day and night. And now she didn't. She still hallucinated these animals, but they were permanently, because there's always staff in the home, outside the home. They would get to the window and she could see them at the window and think, you can't get me. And she'd then go and sit down and watch TV or something. And I was 19 at the time. I just did it because it felt like the right behavior to do. I was told off for doing it. I was told that you should never buy into a client's delusions. If the right action is to say, no, you're hallucinating, there's nothing really there. My view was, just because I don't see it doesn't mean my reality is right. She believes her reality is right. Who am I to tell her that the reality she believes is right is fake, and that my reality is more real to me than hers is, and that hers is fake because mine's the real one? Yeah, how's that argument ever going to work with someone, that my reality is the right reality and your reality is the wrong reality? And this was my argument to my managers, was that just doesn't make any logical sense to me. Your reality, her reality was, this is real. She's reacting, she's literally freaking out and smashing things because she believes the reality she's experiencing. If I say, it's okay, you're just hallucinating, it's fine, ignore it, that's dismissive. That's saying that your reality means nothing to me, that I'm not going to treat you as an individual who's got your own individual way of viewing the world, etc. It just, it doesn't resonate with me at all. And what I did led to her comfort and well-being there in the moment. It didn't cure her. She still saw these things. It made her fit in with society, and relatively speaking, she had to stay in the home, but she didn't have any of the problems that she had. It respected her for who she is and how she is. And yeah, she had been like this for sort of seeing these animals try to kill her for, I don't know, decades, perhaps 20 years or something. And she had her and her, I think it was her first husband or something, had set up an animal charity, like a rescue charity, and used to rescue animals and nurse them back to health and then rehome them and stuff like that. And then her husband died a horrible death. And then her second husband died a horrible death. And then a third husband died a horrible death. And she somehow thought that it was the animals responsible for all of this, and all of that kind of knocked on together, that had triggered the kind of onset of her first schizophrenic episodes. And then she just never not had it since then. She was just heavily medicated, but still had the same, still would freak out and smash everything and hallucinate. And this was her in the community. She wasn't even at a level where she would get put into a mental hospital or something, into a psychiatric ward. This was how she was in the community at the time. But that was me doing that as a 19-year-old before I'd even read about Erickson's cases of him doing this with, the manila envelope thing, and respecting people's reality for where it is, and what, and saying if they believe it, I should work with that instead of try and tell them they don't, what they believe is wrong. So yeah, but it's things like that that made me resonate with Milton Erickson's work. But at the same time, as I say, just because there's all these things, you don't want someone to become so kind of enamored with the person that they overlook the flaws as well. So anyway, hopefully some of this has been interesting or helpful or whatever. Feel free to give thumbs up and subscribe if you're not a subscriber, if you find anything interesting. And obviously tomorrow night I'm back doing the sleep meditation live stream, and then Tuesday I'll be back doing another one of these. I really do need to try and figure out how to get them to just 1 hour. Part of getting them to 1 hour would be me not going through the whole chat, because obviously the bit that slows me down is, for example, it was 28 minutes in or something stupid by the time I'd finally not even read everything, but finally got to the bottom of the live chat prior to me actually coming on here live. Um, and so obviously after I'd done that, that was like 28 minutes taken up just to get to the bottom and answer questions. Um, so one way is that whenever I go live, I should just start at the bottom and pretend that nothing has been said, rather than read and see if there's anything of interest or anything that I should respond to or anything. Um, Likewise, not necessarily constantly responding to everything all the way throughout, because obviously that's one issue, where it's like an hour in, I might have said what I'm here to say or doing, but I've responded to the live chat. And I'm aware that I'm kind of way away from the bottom on the live chat, and so I then end up thinking I don't want to let anyone down by not responding to I don't want to let anyone down by not responding to any questions they might have asked that I can't see yet. And so I want to then read to the bottom and answer everyone's questions, but obviously every minute that I'm reading and answering a question, I'm probably saying something that's generating more questions. And so I then answer those questions, and I keep going and going and going, and then 3 hours have gone. Um, so yeah, so it's just trying to work on what's the best way that doesn't let everyone down in the live chat, doesn't make you all think, oh, Dan just never answers it, because I do get those comments. The why does Dan never answer any of my questions comments, and I do try to make sure I'm answering everyone's questions. Yeah, you do get different managers wanting different things. Some good managers, some bad. And yeah, trusting your gut is good to do, but at the same time, it can also be something that's bad to do, because you need to have the knowledge so that that gut instinct is based on knowledge, not just some kind of fanciful thinking or something. But then other times you just somehow instinctively seem to know right. What I like is that based on just what I've ended up studying, my gut instinct of what I used to do matches with what I've learned since doing it. So I've carried on doing it. So yeah, learning how to shout doesn't help if I can't see the comment and I just think, right, I'm going right down to the bottom now. But as I can't remember who it was, somebody commented hours and hours ago before the live stream. I can't remember which one of you it was. And I'm not scrolling to the top to see. I wonder whether Dan will keep it to, I wonder whether I'll keep it to 3 hours when I'm talking about Erickson. There is that difficulty that if I'm talking about Milton Erickson, there's so much I could talk about in relation to Erickson and obviously to hypnosis in general that I literally could talk. Well, when I've done my training courses, I can talk for 6 or 8 hours. And fortunately, even the students are shocked that that much time has gone because I can so easily forget to have breaks and things. And I have had that on training courses where I'm there with like 30 people and literally we've got to the end of the day and I'm saying, oh, we're going to get kicked out shortly. And we've not taken a break. We've forgotten to take breaks. We're literally right at the end. Whatever you do, don't bake cookies. That won't stop you. Yeah. So, so literally, if it comes to like talking about Erickson and telling stories about Erickson from what I know from all the books I've read, because obviously I have read literally every single one on all these shelves behind me. I can go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Yeah, you don't want a Milton Erickson week literally, I could just pick one book and say, right, today we're going to talk about the stuff that he teaches in this book or whatever, and it would go on. But yeah, so baking cookies. Tell yourself, if I start feeling like baking cookies, then I'll do something else. I don't know. Then I'll distract myself, or then I'll forget, or something like that. Yeah. If you obviously say the negative, your brain has to process the positive to know what it's supposed to not do. And what it doesn't tell you is what you do instead. So if it's like, don't bake cookies, your brain has to think about baking cookies and then think, now what is the opposite, or what is the thing you do? If so, don't bake cookies. Well, I can imagine baking cookies. What do I now do instead? And you don't have the what do I do instead. But you can use like an implementation intention. So, you know, when when I feel like baking cookies, then I'll ignore the thoughts or something like that. And if you tell yourself that, so focus on telling yourself that, so that you're not just saying it to yourself like while you're walking around making a cup of tea, but actually sitting down and thinking, okay, when I think about baking cookies, then I'll ignore that thought, or then I'll forget about it, or something like that. The interesting thing, in fact, I'm not even going to go there because, or else I'll still be here in 4 hours' time. But implementation intentions can make a whole session on itself about how they can work, how you set it up, how you make it so they work effectively. In fact, they're probably one of the most successful, easiest to do ways of doing self hypnosis that everyone should do. But yes, so thank you for joining me here. Obviously, I'm grateful for when anyone's on here, and I'm not talking just to myself in an empty room. And yeah, maybe Tuesday. And so, yeah, thank you all for joining me. Feel free to give a thumbs up if you haven't already. Feel free to subscribe if you're not subscribed. And I will see those of you who want to join me tomorrow night at 10 p.m. that's UK time, for the sleep meditation creation session thing. And then on the Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. UK time again for the next whatever I do here type thing. So I will let you all go now. You've all been patient and sat there for ages, and I've sat here for ages. So yes, you'll have to remember, whatever you do, don't forget to mention the polar bear tomorrow. So that's, don't forget to mention the polar bear tomorrow. So I will see you all, or those of you here tomorrow.